Chapter 2383. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. The genius from the demon god realm was horrified. How was this possible? His attack had been played around with by his opponent. One had to know that that was his most powerful attack. Not only had it failed to hurt Yixian, but it had also been tamed by Yixian. 1357924? 6810 GGGGG. That was the power of two different laws. How could it have been tamed? For a time, that person was in disarray because such a strange scene had exceeded the limits of his imagination. How did you do it? The genius from the demon god realm asked Yixian subconsciously. Unfortunately, Yixian didn't have any intention of paying attention to him. Instead, he casually waved his hand. The black ball that had combined the power of the devouring and lightning laws disappeared. No, this is impossible. This is an illusion. This must be an illusion. No one can break my devouring lightning ball. Impossible, impossible. Yixian repeated the word impossible several times in a row, which undoubtedly revealed the fear and shock in his heart. As he cried out in alarm, a new attack was formed in his hand. However, before he could attack, Yixian had already appeared beside him. Yixian waved his hand casually and the law attack that the genius had been forming was snatched away by Yixian. That's right, it was snatched away. With a wave of his hand, the law attack that the genius from the demon god realm had used fell into Yixian's hand like a well-behaved baby. The genius from the demon god realm hurriedly retreated in horror. However, no matter how fast he was, Yixian would always appear beside him. Yixian just looked at him indifferently, but his attention was focused on the power of his laws. System, can I devour the power of the lightning laws? Ding! System notification. The host is currently in a special space. Forced devouring is not allowed. Yixian was slightly disappointed, but he had guessed that this was possible. All of a sudden, Yixian raised his head and looked at the genius from the demon god domain. Although it was just a casual glance, the genius from the demon celestial realm felt as if he had been completely locked onto by Yixian. It was as if his every move and action were clearly under Yixian's control. This feeling was really uncomfortable. Unfortunately, whether it felt good or not, this guy couldn't do anything about it. At this moment, he no longer had the confidence and arrogance from before. The demon god domain genius's eyes were filled with fear and helplessness. His body was trembling uncontrollably. Clearly, he was extremely afraid of Yixian. Alright, let's end this. Although the Eternal Territory was extremely powerful, it had a limited duration. Yixian naturally wouldn't waste any time. For Yixian, he had spent a total of 5 Eternal Points to exchange for the Eternal Domain. Wasn't it all to defeat this person? Pa! A slap in the face. It was actually a slap. This was a battle between godly monarchs. It was normal to use mystiques or nomological powers, but to use a slap to hit the enemy, how much pressure did it take to do so? The most important thing was the result of this slap. Yixian's slap had actually shattered the demon god domain genius's godhead. A slap could actually shatter the opponent's godhead. Who had ever seen such a powerful force? This was especially so for the demon god domain genius. After being slapped by Yixian, he felt as if all the power that belonged to him was rapidly disappearing. To be more precise, Yixian had stripped him of all his power in the time it took to slap him. Whether it was nomological powers or the divine power in his body, everything had disappeared. At this moment, that person was actually a cripple. After pausing in midair for a short second, the demon god domain genius fell to the ground. The feeling of falling infinitely made the demon god realm genius scream hysterically and hysterically. Unfortunately, no one was paying attention to him anymore. Bam! Finally, he made intimate contact with the ground and fell to his death instantly. At the same time, the Eternal Domain's time was finally up. That violent power instantly returned to Yixian's body. At this moment, Yixian looked no different from before. However, even the referee was stunned for a moment before announcing the result. After all, the power that Yixian had displayed was too strong. It was so strong that even the powerful referees couldn't believe their eyes. What kind of power was this? What kind of method was this? A super genius from the demon god domain was actually like a child in front of Yixian. He was so powerless and so pitiful. When the result was announced, even the people fighting in the other arenas subconsciously stopped fighting. This was because the strange and powerful power that had erupted from Yi Xian had actually penetrated the space of the arena and made them feel it. Ri-1R, especially those who were also lower divine kings, they were already trembling because they knew that even if they were of a higher cultivation level than Yi Xian, if Yi Xian had really fought with them, they would definitely die if Yi Xian unleashed that power just now. While Yi Xian was killing the geniuses of the demon god domain, he naturally wouldn't let go of their Qian Kuan rings. When the result was announced and confirmed that he had won, Yi Xian didn't hesitate to devour the resources in those Qian Kuan rings. Yi Xian's intention was clear. If there was a need, he would continue to fight in the next arena. Ding! The host has broken through. The current level is Lower Divine King Realm. He actually rose 3 levels. He was indeed a genius from the demon god domain. The resources in his hands were indeed abundant. However, Yi Xian didn't show it at all. This was the Overgod arena and he didn't want to cause trouble for himself. The powerhouses who noticed these changes also shut their mouths silently. Needless to say, the experts from the Kunlun divine domain weren't stupid enough to cause trouble for themselves. As for the experts from the demon god domain, they could only keep quiet because all of their lower divine king realm geniuses had been defeated. No one could fight with Yi Xian anymore. Besides, Yi Xian's sudden burst of power just now was just a level up. It couldn't be compared to the power he had just displayed. The Kunlun divine domain had won the lower divine king realm arena. After that, Yi Xian didn't have to wait for too long. The battles in the other arenas had all ended. Of course, the battle that left the deepest impression on people was Yi Xian's battle. How could they not remember that kind of overwhelming power? No one knew whether it was Yi Xian's victory that caused the other lower divine kings to feel uneasy. In short, the Kunlun divine domain had won 7 out of the 9 lower divine kings' battles. Chapter 2384. After that, the crowd was led out of the Overgod arena once more. What awaited them was Mi Li's reward. 1357924? 6810 GGGGGD. As for what the Overgod arena was about, Yi Xian and the others didn't know, nor did they have the right to ask. Their mission was simply to obtain victory. However, these geniuses could be said to have suffered an incomparably heavy loss. Those who could return in 100 people less than 1 person. From this, one could see just how cruel the Overgod arena was. When they returned to the Overgod palace, they didn't receive the grand welcome they'd expected. Mi Li merely spoke a few words, and after discovering some rewards, she left it at that. Of course, these rewards were nothing to scoff at. Furthermore, the geniuses who participated in the Overgod arena would receive special nurturing from the Overgod realm. As long as they returned alive from the Overgod arena, they would receive benefits they couldn't even dream of and reach the heavens in a single bound. While the others quietly retreated to celebrate, Yi Xian was summoned by Mi Li alone. This wasn't the first time Yi Xian had been summoned by Mi Li alone. But this time Yi Xian was a little more reserved. Yi Xian already had a clear understanding of Mi Li's authority. This was a Overgod who could send trillions of experts to their deaths with a single word. She was the undisputed #1 expert of the Kunlun god realm. Greetings, Overgod, Overgod. Yi Xian bowed slightly and stood respectfully in front of Mi Li. Mi looked at Yi Xian, then lightly smiled and said, "This time you did well. Go back and prepare well. I'm afraid the next Lord God's arena won't be far away." There was another Overgod arena? Yi Xian was already scared out of his wits after playing the Overgod arena once. If he played it again, wouldn't Yi Xian lose his life? Although Yi Xian only had a slight change in his emotions, how could it possibly escape Mi Li's notice? Don't worry, the next Master God Challenge ring won't be so cruel. I called you here this time because I have a reward for you alone. I've already heard that your performance this time was the most outstanding, so you deserve this reward. At the same time, she handed a treasure box to Yi Xian. Yi Xian subconsciously took it, but he didn't know what it was. Of course, now that he was in the Divine Master Palace, he could not open it directly. Yi Xian, although your performance in the Overgod's battle arena was not bad, your expeditionary army of 9 directions and 60,000 realms was not very satisfactory. Last time, I mobilized the armies of the other regional commanders to help you. However, this does not conform to the rules of the Overgod's battle arena. You still have to work hard. Yes, Divine Master. All right, you can leave now. Yixian acknowledged and left. Yixian didn't feel anything when he faced Mi Li before, but recently, he clearly felt that something was different. Mi Li's aura was simply too strong, and it wasn't just her aura, but also her temperament. It was just that before, Yixian didn't have an official position, so Mi Li only thought of him as her master's disciple or friend. Now that Yixian had an official position, he finally understood Mi Li's strength. After walking out of the Divine Master Palace, Yixian immediately opened the box. After all, this was what he obtained after risking his life in the Overgod's battle arena. Yixian wanted to see what was inside the box. A token. A token that emitted a strange light. Could this be Mi Li's reward? What was the use of this thing? But soon, the moment Yixian opened the box, a message came out of the box and directly into Yixian's head. In an instant, Yixian understood what it was. This was the qualification token for the Kunlun God Domain's Ancestral Land Secret Realm. What was the Ancestral Land Secret Realm? When every God Domain was born, there would be a place of origin, and usually it would be a secret realm. This secret realm would be constantly reinforced by successive divine masters, and if the super experts of the God Domain were to die, they would automatically choose to die there. It could be said that the Ancestral Land Secret Realm was the graveyard of the God Domain. It was the collective grave of the super experts of the God Domain. The experts who could walk in by themselves would naturally pass away in there. And if the experts who died in battle could be found, they would be sent in as well. It could be said that the Ancestral Land Secret Realm was the core and most mysterious place of the God Domain. And there was no need to mention the opportunities and dangers inside. Most of the experts, if they didn't have a successor in the outside world, would leave their legacy in the ancestral land. After all, only true geniuses were qualified to enter the rented land. The reason why these experts left their legacy was because they hoped that one day, their legacy would be inherited by a genius and continue to be passed down. What were the experts of the God Domain? That was the strongest power in a God Domain. Generally speaking, only those who had reached the level of Master God Emperor could enter that place. In other words, it wouldn't be too much to call the Ancestral Land Secret Realm the graveyard of the God Emperors. Now Yixian was holding a token to enter the graveyard of the God Emperors. It was a special token that could only be used once. Using this token, Yixian could be directly transported in. When he wanted to leave, he only needed to activate the token and he would be able to leave. Although the treasure hunt in the Ancestral Land Secret Realm could not be called the best reward in the God Domain, it was still one of the top few rewards. What one could obtain would depend on one's luck. What should he do? Should he use it? Yixian had doubts in his heart. He didn't know how many people had obtained the qualifications to enter the Ancestral Land Secret Realm. But he believed that there wouldn't be many. In that case, should he enter now? Rai Xian looked into the distance. In the end, he decided to enter now. Power. Yixian was in desperate need of power now. In the past, a 4th-grade Divine King Realm cultivator was considered pretty good. Unfortunately, he was now the provincial governor who was in charge of the 9 directions and 60,000 territories. A mere lower-grade Divine King Realm cultivator was nothing compared to him. Those big families under Yixian, although they didn't say anything on the surface, would definitely slander Yixian in secret. After all, the God Domain was also a world where power was respected. Only the strong had the right to be respected by others. Since that was the case, then he would use it now. Yixian wanted to see what was so special about the Ancestral Land Secret Realm of the Kunlun God Domain. Yixian held the token in his hand and instantly activated the teleportation. After a while, Yixian's figure appeared at the entrance of a secret realm. What a strange space. This was Yixian's first reaction. In this secret realm there was no sunlight at all. There was only a kind of dark light. In layman's terms, it was a ghost fire. Chapter 2385. After all, those who were buried here, even the weakest ones, were low-level God Emperors. 1357924? 6810G, not to mention inferior God Emperors. Even those with divine sparks would find it difficult to destroy their corpses even if they died. Without tens of millions of years, the corpses of these experts would not decay at all. Of course, there was something special about this secret realm. There was a strange power of law everywhere in this secret realm. This power of law was completely useless because its only use was to accelerate the decay of the corpses. Of course, there were other things in the secret realm that would accelerate the decay of the corpses. At this moment, Yi Xian was standing on a circular platform. This was the reception platform. Those who entered the ancestral land secret realm using a token would appear on a platform similar to the one Yi Xian was standing on. This was because this secret realm did not have any entrances or exits. If one wanted to enter, they had to use a teleportation token. If anyone were to accidentally lose the token, they would be trapped inside and die. Yi Xian did not move. He stood silently on the reception platform and carefully observed his surroundings. Before entering this place, there was no map or any information about this secret realm. If Yi Xian wanted to explore this place, he would have to choose his own route. With the reception platform as the center, broken pieces of land could be seen everywhere. Perhaps this secret realm used to be a complete piece of land, but it was now divided into countless small pieces. These broken pieces of land were what Yi Xian wanted to explore this time. This was because some of the broken pieces of land were the tombs of the experts who entered. Not far in front of Yi Xian was a piece of land. On this land there was a majestic palace. However, Yi Xian had no intention of exploring this place. He was so close to the reception platform. Yi Xian would not believe that there would be any inheritance left. Yi Xian did not observe for too long. No matter how he observed, he would not be able to see anything without experiencing it himself. With a leap, Yi Xian was already high up in the air. Yi Xian didn't have a specific goal in mind. Right now, he was just randomly choosing a direction. Pieces of broken land retreated from Yi Xian's side. Meanwhile, Yi Xian was constantly choosing his targets. Finally, a broken piece of land caught the attention of Yi Xian. There were no palaces on this broken continent, but there was a mysterious plant growing on it. There was not even any sunlight in the ancestral land Mystery Land, but there was still a plant which was a little strange. Yi Xian landed on the broken piece of land and said to the system, "System, scan this thing. I want to see what it is." Ding! System notification. Scan successful. Target set Ghost Vine. Ding! System notification. A special plant, Ghost Vine, has been detected. The host can find the heart of the Ghost Vine to upgrade the 1,000 vines. Ding! System notification. The Ghost Vine is formed from the divine power and precepts of a fallen elite. It is said to be a plant, but it has its own instincts. The preliminary assessment is that it is dangerous. Please be careful. Dangerous? This was the ancestral land, the graveyard of countless elites. It would be strange if there was no danger. However, he did not expect to find something that could be used to upgrade the 1,000 vines as soon as he arrived. Naturally, Yi Xian would not miss this opportunity. The heart of the Ghost Vine? No matter what it was, as long as he killed the Ghost Vine, he would be able to find it soon. Yi Xian pulled out the Godslayer. At the same time, he let Wei Zhentian transform into a magic treasure. Then the two Godslayer swords circled around Yi Xian, ready to defend at any time. At the same time, Yi Xian took out the rule Heavenly Bow and held it in his hand. 1,000 Beast Sword Servant. Yi Xian immediately summoned the 1,000 Beast Sword Servant. He wanted to use the 1,000 Beast Sword Servant to test the strength of the Ghost Vine. Following Yi Xian's order, the 1,000 Beast Sword Servants summoned their divine beast mounts and rushed over without hesitation. Yi Xian stood in place and did not make any unnecessary movements. He just waited silently. The 1,000 Beast Sword Servant led the divine beast mounts and charged continuously. The Ghost Vine seemed to be really ordinary plants at this time. There was no reaction at all. Of course, the system notification said that the Ghost Vine was a dangerous existence. Therefore, Yi Xian did not believe that this thing was that simple. Suddenly, a section of the Ghost Vine moved. Speed was incomparably fast. Even though Yi Xian had used his divine sense to completely envelop the area, the only thing he could sense was that the Ghost Vine had moved a little. However, he couldn't sense what it had done because its speed was simply too fast. However, at least 10 divine beast mounts had disappeared in the blink of an eye. Yi Xian immediately gathered his divine consciousness there. After a while, he discovered that the divine beast mounts had been completely surrounded by the Ghost Vine. The Ghost Vine was like a divine snake, tightly wrapping around the Lord Divine Beast mounts. After a while, It strangled the divine beast mounts to death. As for the leveled-up mounts, they could not resist at all. What a strong defense! Yi Xian clearly saw one of the divine beast mounts viciously bite the ghost vine before it died. Unfortunately, it had no effect at all. This ghost vine actually had an incomparably strong defense. System, detect the strength of this ghost vine. Why is its defense so strong? Ding! System notification. Detection successful. Host, please note that the ghost vine has a special ability. All the ghost vines here are actually just one stalk. The ghost vine can gather the power of all its branches at any location according to its will. Yi Xian was slightly shocked. One had to know that in front of Yi Xian, the ghost vine covered every corner of this broken continent. It would not be an exaggeration to call it a forest. However, he did not expect that this was just one stalk. Super Devouring system also. Its special ability to gather power made Yi Xian's eyes light up as he was shocked. One had to know that, for example, Yi Xian's 1,000 vines, every single one of them had an average defense and attack power. But what if they could gather strength? In that case, the increase in combat prowess would not be just a little bit. Whether it was used in a direct battle or a sneak attack, it would definitely produce unexpected results. Imagine that Yi Xian was using the 1,000 vines to fight an enemy. The 1,000 vines, which did not seem to be a threat at first, suddenly gathered power as it approached the enemy, causing one of the vines to suddenly possess super strength. Any enemy would be caught off guard. Good stuff. Good ability. Chapter 2386. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. If the 1,000 vines had this ability, it would be extremely powerful. 1357924? 6810 However, this was not the only surprise. Just as Yi Xian was observing the ghost vine, dozens of different nomological powers suddenly attacked the god-tier mount. These were dozens of different nomological powers. Could it be that the ghost vine had mastered dozens of nomological powers? System, what's going on? Why is the ghost vine able to master so many nomological powers? Ding! System notification. The ghost vine has a special ability, devour and store. Ding! The ghost vine will automatically capture the nomological powers that it can capture. Once it has successfully captured them, it will store them and use them as an attack when needed. There was such an ability? Yi Xian was slightly stunned. This ability was simply too powerful. However, it was probably only suitable for use in rented land. After all, super strong people could enter rented land at any time and die there. What was the nomological powers? It was a special power that could not be explained clearly. Even super strong people at the Emperor God realm could only borrow nomological powers. However, when they reached the Emperor God realm and died, the nomological powers they borrowed might be left behind for a short period of time, giving the ghost vine a chance to capture them. If it were someone else, such as the enemies Yi Xian had killed, how could the nomological powers be left behind? When they died, the nomological powers would automatically disappear without a trace. Therefore, this power was not something that Yi Xian could obtain. Even if he did, it would be useless. However, from here, it would undoubtedly become an obstacle for Yi Xian to kill the ghost vine. 1,000 Beasts Feast. Yi Xian activated the 1,000 Beasts Feast ability, which improved the mount's ability once again. Although Yi Xian did not expect to defeat the ghost vine with just the 1,000 beast sword servants and the god-tier mount, Yi Xian hoped to understand the ghost vine's various abilities through the 1,000 beast sword servants and the god-tier mount. The ghost vine continued to fight with the god-tier mount, but it seemed to be crushing the god-tier mount. Although the god-tier mount kept attacking, it was futile even if they could destroy some of the ghost vine. After all, there were just too many ghost vines here. How many of them could the god-tier mount destroy? Suddenly, Yi Xian noticed a problem. The ghost vine that was destroyed by the god-tier mount did not seem to be regenerating immediately. Yi Xian's translation: the ghost vine Yi Xian at first because of the 1,000 vines Yi, but now it seemed like that was not the case. Swordsman sword servants. Yi Xian summoned the swordsman. Previously, Yi Xian didn't summon the divine flower sword attendant, because he felt that even if the divine flower sword attendant came out, it wouldn't be of any use. Translation. Translation is translation Xian translation. As on as translation. Go, destroy to your heart's content. Yixian ordered. Soon, all the god-tier mounts and the 100-flower god began to destroy the ghost vine. They were not the only ones. Wei Zhentian also charged forward with his 2 god-slayer swords. Yixian drew his rule divine bow again and again. Each shot a rule devouring divine arrow. Yixian's goal was clear. He wanted to destroy at all costs. He wanted to destroy the ghost vine as much as possible. God-tier mounts were constantly being killed. At the same time, the ghost vine was also being cut down. Piece by piece, the ghost vine fell to the ground and turned into black smoke before disappearing. Yixian did not care about this at all. He only had one thought in his mind: destroy to his heart's content. Even if the ghost vine's power could be condensed, it was still condensed from his countless vines. At this moment, Yixian was continuously cutting down his vines. Didn't that mean that he was continuously weakening his strength? Although the god-tier mounts and the 100-flower god were constantly disappearing, Yixian was actually not at a disadvantage. Finally, when the last god-tier mount was killed, Yixian decisively withdrew from the battle. He was waiting. When the cooldown time was up, a new wave of attacks would erupt. Yixian wanted to wear down this 1,000 vines to death. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, finally most of the ghost vine had been cleared away. At this moment, Yixian was only left with a few hundred ghost vines. These ghost vines could no longer pose a threat to Yixian. At the same time, the so-called heart of the ghost vine was finally revealed. It turned out that the ghost vine was able to condense power. This so-called heart of the ghost vine was distributed to all the vines. As Yixian continued to kill, the power of the heart of the ghost vine could only continuously retreat to the remaining vines. Plants are plants after all. What a pity. Although you have such strong power, you are only a ghost vine. You only have battle instincts but not true intelligence. Yixian said softly as he looked at the ghost vine in front of him calmly. Although he knew in his heart that the ghost vine could not possibly understand what he was saying. Kill. At Yixian's command, the cooldown time was up again. Then, he summoned the 1,000 beast sword servants and the flower god sword servants. They immediately charged forward with their god-tier mounts and the 100-flower god. The 2 god-slaying swords would not be left behind. They also charged forward. Sections of the ghost vine were continuously cut down. Finally, when all the ghost vine disappeared, a dark green light was left behind. That was the so-called heart of the ghost vine. Qiantung. Yixian did not hesitate. He had fought for so long to strengthen Qiantung. Qiantung suddenly charged forward and absorbed the group in a moment. Unfortunately, it did not level up. Well, if only Qiantung could level up that easily. However, Yixian could clearly feel that Qiantung's power had increased by a lot. Especially now that Qiantung had the ability to gather power, it was naturally more powerful. Asterisk // equals Yixian did not waste any more time. He immediately got up and charged into the distance again in search of his next target. However, what Yixian did not know was that the ghost vine was actually the lowest level existence in the ancestral land. It would not be an exaggeration to call it a weed. However, just a mere weed in this ancestral land had such a powerful strength that it blocked Yixian's path for more than half a month. It was obvious how powerful the ancestral land was. In fact, Yixian knew very well that it was impossible to explore the entire ancestral land in one go. Chapter 2387. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. After leaving this broken continent, Yixian quickly arrived at another broken continent. 1357924? 6810 GGGD. Ever since leaving the first broken continent, Yixian had requested for the system to remain in detection mode. Here, the system gave Yixian a notification. Ding. System notification. A special material that can be used to repair the god-slaying armor has been detected. It is recommended that the hosts collect it. Yes, it was the material to repair the god-slaying armor. Ever since Yixian had obtained the god-slaying armor, he could only store it in his Qian Kuan ring because it was too damaged. He did not expect to find a suitable material this time. Yixian did not hesitate and quickly arrived at the broken continent. When Yixian saw what was on the broken continent, his heart skipped a beat. In front of Yixian was a structure that looked like an inverted pyramid. Yixian had no idea what this structure was made of. However, at the bottom of the structure was a door. From this door, the entire inverted pyramid grew larger and larger. Yixian walked in and realized that this door was actually an elevator. He only needed to control it with his divine telekinesis, and then activate his divine power to ascend. This place was like a treasure trove. However, there was nothing at the bottom. Even if there was, it would have been taken away by someone else. It was only when Yixian entered the 99th level that he saw the first item. It was a box made of some unknown wood. Yixian did not hesitate and jumped down from the elevator. The box was very simple and unadorned, and there was nothing special about it. However, when Yixian tried to use his divine sense to investigate the contents, he was shocked to discover that his divine sense couldn't see what was inside at all. What exactly was this thing? Open it? Yixian hesitated for a while but finally opened it. Of course, he still had to make the necessary preparations. After all, on this 99th level, the rest of the space was extremely empty. Only this box was placed at the entrance. How could no one have taken such a conspicuous location? No matter how you look at it, it doesn't seem normal. Yixian held onto the rule divine bow and immediately retreated 100 steps. Wei Zhentian controlled the two god-slaying swords and was also prepared to attack. After that, Yixian summoned the sword servants of 10,000 Sun. Sword attendant Wan Sun did not have much attack power, but his senses were very sharp. If there was any danger, he would be the first to sense it. Therefore, he was the most suitable person to open the box. However, when sword attendant Wan Sun tried, he was shocked to find that he couldn't open it at all. Could it be that sword attendant Wan Sun was too small and did not have enough strength? Although this reason was somewhat laughable, Yixian could only think of it this way. Without any hesitation, Yixian summoned the withered bone sword servant again. In any case, the withered bone sword servant had been eliminated long ago. Yixian did not know how long it had been since he had used it in battle. Now that he was using it to open the chest, it could be considered as a chance for him to get some fresh air. However, the withered bone sword servant was still unable to open the chest. Damn it, what's so special about this box? Yixian frowned slightly. Megatron, destroy this chest for me. Yixian immediately gave the order. Megatron instantly activated, and the two Godslayer swords slashed at the chest continuously. It was useless. It was completely useless. Even the Godslayer swords could not split open this mysterious chest. This time Yixian's interest was really piqued. Yixian did not care about how much he took. He directly walked towards the chest. Yixian put away the law divine bow. Then Yixian reached out his hand. Suddenly, an incomparably violent attractive force erupted. Yixian's divine power surged into the chest like a tidal wave. Damn it, what's going on? Yixian was shocked, but there was nothing he could do. System, quickly think of a way to solve this. Yixian could only call for help from the system. At this time, Yixian could not move at all except for his thoughts. Even his heartbeat had completely stopped. Meanwhile, his divine power was continuously being absorbed by the chest. What the hell was this damn chest? Why did it have such a strong attractive force? Ding! System notification. Detected that the host has been affected by an unknown situation and is losing divine power severely. Looking for a solution. Ding! System notification. Solution failed. Initiating emergency plan. Ding! Successfully exchanged resources for divine power. Yixian had painstakingly saved up a small amount of resources. At this time, they were being continuously converted into divine power and then absorbed. That chest was like a bottomless pit, constantly swallowing Yixian's divine power. Ding! Resources used up. Activating faith points to exchange for divine power. Resources gone. Yixian was extremely shocked. At this time, he could not do anything at all. He could only allow the chest to continuously absorb the divine power in his body. Yixian had always been the one to devour others. He did not expect that there would be a day when he would be devoured. Most importantly, what was devouring him was a chest. Faith points quickly disappeared. and countless divine power entered Yixian's body. However, it was quickly absorbed by the chest again. Ding! System notification. Faith points depleted. It's over. This was the first time Yixian had such a feeling. However, before he had time to think, he felt that the chest had actually focused its attention on the devouring space, and then quickly absorbed the divine power from the devouring space. Yixian was extremely sad. Was he really going to be sucked dry by a chest here today? Yixian finally understood why no one touched the chest. It was because those who touched it had already had their divine power sucked dry. But what was this damn thing? Why was it here? Even if it was here, why was it so strong? Yixian wanted to close his eyes, but unfortunately he could not move. Large amounts of divine power were being drained from the devouring space. Yixian could even feel that the living creatures and plants inside were wilting. How much divine power had this chest absorbed? Gotcha! Suddenly there was a soft sound. Then the chest slowly opened. Could it be that it had absorbed so much divine power just to open this chest? If that was really the case, then this box was a little too much. Suddenly, a ray of light flew towards Yixian. Yixian could feel that there was something extra on his head. At the same time, the system notification sounded. Ding! System notification. Congratulations to the host. You have accidentally discovered the ancient divine emperor's imperial crown. Ding! The imperial crown has recognized the host's identity as the successor of the ancient divine emperor. It has automatically recognized the host. Chapter 2388. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Yixian was slightly taken aback. 1357924? 6810G. The Imperial Crown. The legacy of the ancient god emperor? What was going on? Why would the imperial crown of the ancient god emperor appear in the ancestral grounds of the Kunlun divine domain? What was going on? Yixian could not understand. No matter how hard he tried, he could not understand. Could it be that the ancient god emperor was originally from the Kunlun divine domain? Clearly that was not the case. The ancient god emperor should be from another divine domain. Because Yixian had come to the Kunlun divine domain, he could be considered to have some strength and background. However, no one had come to look for him. In that case, why did the ancient god emperor's monarch crown appear here? However, no matter how Yixian guessed, the truth was that he was completely powerless now. Very quickly, Yixian regained his ability to move. Furthermore, he was not injured at all. Other than a large amount of his divine power being sucked away, he was not affected in any other way. Yixian used his divine consciousness to check his head. However, he did not find the so-called imperial crown. Instead, there was a strange pattern on his forehead. Could this pattern be the so-called imperial crown? But what was the use of this thing? It had almost sucked Yixian dry. Even the devouring space had a large amount of divine power sucked away. If it was not useful at all, then Yixian would have suffered a great loss. System, examine this emperor's crown. I need detailed information. Ding! System notification scanning data. Ding! Scan successful. The imperial crown of the ancient god emperor was formed by a powerful being who gathered unknown special items from a mysterious place, fusing unknown special materials, and combining unknown laws of nature. Ding! Because the host's current cultivation level is too low, only the imperial crown has been activated to increase the host's resistance to laws of nature. Yixian was confused. Faced with so many unknowns, he was confused. He did not know what was going on. It was all unknown. Furthermore, because his cultivation level was not high enough, he did not know what those materials and laws of nature were. However, this also indirectly illustrated a problem. That was, this overlord crown was no ordinary item. Thinking about it, Yixian had picked up a huge bargain for nothing. Although the emperor's crown only increased his resistance to laws, as his strength increased, there might be new functions that would appear. Besides, law resistance was also a very good attribute. How could Yixian not be satisfied? Even though this thing should logically belong to him. What Yixian didn't know was that in a distance that he couldn't see, there was a pair of eyes silently observing this scene through some sort of special ability. Only after Yixian put away the emperor's crown did that person stop spying. Yixian looked at the box on the ground with lingering fear. he realized that the box was really an ordinary wooden box. In other words, the thing that had absorbed the divine power was the strange rune on Yixian's forehead, the so-called imperial crown. Without hesitation, Yixian walked up the elevator again and looked for the treasure that could strengthen his god-slaying armor. The elevator continued to move forward. The higher one went in this inverted golden tower, the more space there was. Fortunately, Yixian kept the system in detection mode, so when he reached the 963rd floor, he finally heard a system notification. Ding! System notification. Attention, host. Target discovered. Yixian stopped ascending and walked directly to this floor. This floor was a strange maze. However, compared to other places, there were some strange sounds here. Rustle, rustle, rustle. From this sound, Yixian could tell that it was some kind of small animal crawling. However, Yixian did not know what exactly it was. Sword Attendant Wan Sun, go and find a path for me. Yixian released the Sword Attendant Wan Sun. After all, he did not know what exactly was waiting for him. The Sword Attendant Wan Sun rushed out quickly, but it retreated even faster. However, when the Sword Attendant Wan Sun retreated, it was followed by a large group of ants. No, they should not be called ants. Even calling them divine ants would not be correct. Although these things did indeed have the appearance of ants, they had the size of cowboys. The key was that there was an endless number of them. Damn it! Godslaying slash. Yixian did not hesitate. He pulled out his sword and swung it in one go. A beam of sword light instantly rushed over. No less than 100 divine ants were killed. However, compared to the size of the swarm, it was nothing. Boom! Yixian exerted force with his feet and jumped into the air. He did not want to be held back by these divine ants. However, Yixian did not expect that the moment he jumped into the air, tens of thousands of divine ants on the ground also jumped into the air. Megatron, kill them for me. Yixian did not hesitate and immediately released Megatron. It could be said that these divine ants were not very strong, but there were too many of them. Moreover, their defense was extremely strong. Even the god-slaying sword would not be able to kill them in one strike. What exactly were these things? Yixian floated in the air and retreated again and again. However, it was not a good idea to continue retreating. Suddenly, a strange divine beast rushed out from the side of Yixian and dashed past Yixian, not daring to stay for a moment. When Yixian looked over, he saw that it was a group of divine ants chasing after him. There were still a dozen divine ants on the divine beast's body. Some of them had been killed by the divine beast, but their pants-like mouths were still biting the divine beast's body. This was a divine beast. Yixian knew that this divine beast had a certain level of strength from the lightning it emitted as it ran. However, when faced with this group of divine ants, he had no other choice but to run. From the system's notification, Yixian knew that what he wanted was right in front of him, behind this group of divine ants. However, could Yixian really deal with this group of divine ants so easily? System. Detect the strength of these divine ants. Ding. System notification. Target specified. Divine Skeletal Overlord Ant Strong Defense. Average attack. Divine Skeletal Overlord Ant? Yixian suddenly felt that this name was a little cheap. However, these divine ants did have the right to be called Overlord Ants. Yixian had to get his hands on a treasure that could repair the engulfing armor. Therefore, Yixian could not care less. The strength of this item lay in its defense, but the god-slaying sword was not to be trifled with either. Besides, Yixian had other ideas. Spiritual control. Chapter 2389. Without any hesitation, Yixian walked forward. Beside Yixian, the two god-slaying swords circled around him, ready to kill any that slipped through the net. At the periphery, the divine skeletal overlord ants under the control of their spiritual consciousness were forming a path for Yixian. 1357924? 6810 Yixian walked forward step by step. Around him, the battle continued. One by one, the divine skeletal overlord ants fell beside Yixian. Unfortunately, it did not affect Yixian in the slightest. He did not know how far he had walked. After all, this place was like a maze, twisting and turning left and right, causing Yixian to lose his sense of direction. Fortunately, he finally made it out. At this time, a humongous divine skeletal overlord ant was blocking Yixian's path. This was the divine skeletal overlord Ant's queen. Ding! System notification. Target specified, lower grade divine king realm. A lower grade divine king realm divine ant. As expected of the ancestral land's secret territory, it seemed that anything that appeared was not rare. This divine ant queen was many times larger than the other divine ants. The most important thing was its body. This divine ant queen was actually half human and half ant. System, what's going on? Could it be that this divine ant queen is about to evolve into a human? Ding! System notification. Analyzing data. Ding! System notification. The target is a spiritual deity-type creature that was accidentally transformed from a god emperor who cultivated the ant ancestor's divine ability. Divine ability mutated? Yixian was stunned. Ever since he entered the ancestor realm, all kinds of strange and bizarre things had happened. However, this was just a lower-grade divine king realm expert. Yixian was already a lower-grade divine king realm expert. How could he not be able to deal with this divine ant ancestor? He did not waste any more time and directly attacked. Thousand Beast Sword Servant. Flower God Sword Servant. Help me block the entrance. Don't let the other divine ants cause trouble. With Yixian's order, 1,000 divine level mounts and 100 flower goddesses appeared all of a sudden. They sealed off all the exits and fought with the reinforcements. As for Yixian himself, he directly charged towards the Ant Queen. Megatron go! Wei Zhentian controlled the two god-slaughtering sword S and directly rushed towards the Ant Queen. 14 deity vanquishing slashes were launched. Boom! 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 The violent power caused the Queen Ant to retreat several steps, but she was not injured at all. The power of the deity vanquishing slash only made the ant take a few steps back. Yixian frowned slightly. Wasn't this defense a little too strong? Chi-chi. A strange sound wave came from the Ant Queen's mouth. Clearly, Yixian's actions had angered the Ant Queen. Re-1R the sound wave quickly reverberated in this layer of space. Countless divine ants immediately became extremely irritable. They started to charge fearlessly. One by one, the divine ants swarmed the divine mounts. These divine ants were crazy. Thousand Beasts Feast. Yixian had launched the Thousand Beasts Feast. He could not help the Thousand Beasts Sword Servant in time. Therefore, he could only hope that the Thousand Beasts Sword Servant could hold on for a while longer. Damn it, I don't believe that I can't do anything to you, you evil creature. Yixian drew his Rule Divine Bow and shot Rule Divine arrows at the Ant Queen. A strong light suddenly shone around the Ant Queen and blocked most of the Rule Divine arrows. However, some of the Rule Divine arrows still hit the Ant Queen but were useless. Even the Rule Devouring arrow that Yixian was most familiar with could not do any damage to the Ant Queen. How was this possible? Yixian frowned. He had finally met an enemy that was weaker than him, but could not do anything to him. Absolute Zero. Yixian once again used his ultimate move, Absolute Zero, to seal the Ant Queen in ice. In reality, this was indeed the case. When Yixian used Absolute Zero, the Ant Queen did not have time to dodge and was sealed in ice. However, after being sealed in ice, Yixian and Wei Zhentian used the Godslayer to attack at the same time. They were shocked to find that their attacks were useless. It was the armor on his body. It was the layer of armor-like skin on the Ant Queen that could withstand all of Yixian's attacks, including the Godslayer. How was he supposed to fight this? Yixian was dumbfounded. His attacks were useless against the Ant Queen. How was he supposed to fight? Even after being hit by Absolute Zero, Yixian could not break through the Ant Queen's shell. How was he supposed to kill it? Yixian's figure explosively retreated. At the same time, he quickly pondered in his heart. It was obvious that the special material detected by the system was probably the outer shell of the Ant Queen. This was because such a strong outer shell was indeed qualified to repair the god-slaying armor. However, if he wanted to obtain this outer shell, then Yixian would undoubtedly have to kill this Ant Queen. What was he supposed to do? The power of the laws was almost useless against it. The Godslayer was so sharp, but it could not break through its shell. Then what could Yixian hope to do now? Spiritual control? No, this Ant Queen's spiritual power was much stronger than Yixian's. Yixian could not control the Ant Queen at all. Then what other methods did he have? Suddenly Yixian's eyes lit up. He thought of a possible method. Wei Zhentian Dharma treasure form. Following Yixian's command, the Godslayer automatically returned to Yixian's hand. Wei Zhentian also started to transform rapidly. 1-2. Finally, when it reached the third form, Yixian found what he was looking for. This was a strange sledgehammer, but it had one ability, and that was to become bigger. Moreover, it had no other additional effects. In the past, Yixian would not have even taken a second look at this thing. However, today Yixian was waiting for this blunt weapon. The laws were unlimited. Armor breaking was ineffective. Then what about the blunt weapon? Enlarge. In an instant, the sledgehammer enlarged. Yixian lifted the sledgehammer and smashed it down. Absolute zero. Yixian even restricted the Ant Queen's mobility before he continued to smash it. Once, twice, thrice. Yixian did not even know how many times he had smashed the Ant Queen. However, under Yixian's frenzied attacks, the Ant Queen was finally smashed to death. It wasn't that the Ant Queen didn't put up any resistance, but what could it possibly use to defend itself from the blunt weapon that kept smashing down on it? Under absolute zero, the Ant Queen could not move at all. It could only wait to be smashed to death. At this moment, the Ant Queen did not seem to have changed at all. However, after being smashed so many times by the sledgehammer, even the Ant Queen's godhead had been smashed to pieces, let alone the rest. Yixian smiled slightly. With a wave of his hand, he absorbed the Ant Queen's corpse into the devouring space. After all, this Ant Queen was used to repair the Godslayer armor. Chapter 2390. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. After all, the Queen Ant had only cultivated a tough outer shell. She hadn't cultivated every part of her body. 1357924? 6810G. This time, Yixian had killed the Queen Ant by chance. However, more importantly, Yixian had grasped the Queen Ant's true weakness. At this moment, the defensive line that the Thousand Beast Sword attendants had set up with the God-class mounts could no longer hold on and had been breached. Of course, Yixian didn't care about this at all. In a flash, he activated infinite teleportation and arrived at the elevator in an instant. The reason why he had to take one step at a time was because Yixian wanted to find what he needed. Now that he had found what he needed, Yixian naturally wouldn't waste any time. After a while, Yixian arrived outside. However, he didn't leave immediately. Instead, he wanted to repair the God-slaying armor first. System, I have the materials. Let's begin the forging. Ding. System notification. Begin forging. Ding. System notification. The initial repair of the God-slaying armor is successful. The current damage is 50%. The host can now use it. Since the armor was ready to be used, Yixian wouldn't waste it. He immediately put on the God-slaying armor. After the system's forging, the God-slaying armor's appearance had changed greatly. It was bold and powerful, yet elegant. A few divine power ribbons automatically spread out and surrounded Yixian, adding to Yixian's mysteriousness. Yixian was very satisfied with the God-slaying armor. However, just as Yixian was about to take a closer look at the God-slaying armor, he saw countless divine ants chasing after him from the inverted golden pagoda. Yixian didn't hesitate. He leaped up and quickly left the place. After all, Yixian had killed the queen ant of these divine ants. It would be strange if they didn't go berserk. In the ancestral land, Yixian didn't have any targets. He was just casually exploring. After that, Yixian also found some materials that were useful to him. There was no time limit in the ancestor realm. As long as you could stay inside, you could stay as long as you wanted. This was because the ancestor realm originally only rewarded those super geniuses who made illustrious contributions to the divine realm. Therefore, the people who were able to obtain the qualifications to enter were relatively few. Of course, wanting to stay in the ancestor realm forever was also utterly impossible. Even if one could endure the loneliness of the ancestor realm, the powerful corrosive power and the various powerful existences that could be seen everywhere would force one to withdraw. Yixian relied on the system to avoid danger time and time again. Even if he knew that there was something good ahead, Yixian would decisively give up as long as the system gave him a warning. In any case, there was no one here to compete with him, So there was no need for Yi Xian to provoke those powerful existences for a single treasure. Rather than that, he might as well look for a few slightly inferior treasures. However, sometimes plans couldn't keep up with changes. At this moment, Yi Xian was stumped by the choice in front of him. Ding! System notification. Detected special material, Cosmic Calamity Crystal Core. Ding! System notification. Cosmic Calamity Crystal Core can be used by the system to strengthen various sword servants. At the same time, if the host swallows it himself, he can also obtain special attributes. Ding! Warning! Warning! A powerful divine beast has been detected. Sword intent host, leave immediately. The system's continuous notifications made Yi Xian hesitate. Cosmic Calamity Crystal Core? It was another kind of crystal core that Yi Xian had never heard of before. In fact, Yi Xian's sword servant did feel a little weak now, but he hadn't found a suitable material to strengthen it, so Yi Xian couldn't do anything about it. But now there was such a strengthening item in front of Yi Xian, which could be used to strengthen the power of Yi Xian's sword servant. However, if he wanted to obtain the material, he had to defeat the divine beast. Moreover, it was the divine beast that the system had issued the warning. How to choose? For a moment, Yi Xian was caught in a dilemma. This time, Yi Xian had no choice but to think carefully. After all, something like the Cosmic Calamity Crystal Core could be said to be something that could only be encountered by chance. If he succeeded, Yi Xian would make a big profit. But at the same time, if he failed, Yi Xian would have no choice but to activate the token and leave. This progenitor realm wasn't a place that could be entered at will. Only by obtaining the token from Mi Yan could one be qualified to enter. Therefore, he didn't know when he would be able to enter again. If he failed, then Yi Xian didn't know how many resources he would miss out on. Should he go to this shattered continent? Yi Xian gritted his teeth. In the end, he still decided to enter. Yi Xian was prepared to take a gamble. After making up his mind, Yi Xian landed on the shattered continent. In an instant, a powerful force locked onto Yi Xian. Ding! Warning! Warning! Host has been locked onto by a powerful divine beast. Yi Xian released his spiritual will in an attempt to locate the divine beast. Soon Yi Xian found him. This was a very strange divine beast. This divine beast only had one leg, but 5 arms. It had eyes all over its body, but it didn't have a mouth or a nose. Instead, it had an ear. The most peculiar thing was that its ear was actually its mouth. It could be said that Yi Xian had never seen such a strange-looking divine beast before. System, detect what this thing is? Ding! System notification. Target set, Divine Resentment Beast. God Resentment Beasts. When a God Emperor expert died with unwillingness in their hearts, there was a chance that they would become such divine beasts. Their appearances were randomly generated, but they all had one thing in common, and that was that they could inherit a special divine ability or law of the fallen God Emperor. The divine resentment beasts would develop different personalities according to the regrets of the fallen Emperor God. The divine resentment beast that Yi Xian was facing now contained a resentment of loneliness. When the Emperor God had fallen, he had come to the ancestral land willingly. However, he hadn't died immediately. Instead, he had lived there for thousands of years. These thousands of years had made the Emperor God extremely lonely. Therefore, when he had finally fallen, his only wish had been to have someone by his side. What this divine resentment beast wanted to do the most was to make everyone who entered its territory stay and accompany it forever. The divine resentment beasts all had one thing in common. They weren't willing to leave their original home, which was the shattered continent. It could be said that no divine beast in the ancestral land would leave its own territory easily. This divine resentment beast was even more extreme. It could be said that most divine resentment beasts had never left the shattered continent they were born in. This divine resentment beast's greatest resentment was to have someone by its side forever. At this moment, Yi Xian suddenly landed. Without any hesitation, it immediately locked onto Yi Xian. Yi Xian regretted it as soon as he landed. This was because the divine resentment beast was a first-grade mid-divine king. Chapter 2391. Translator. Atlas Studios Editor. Atlas Studios. Locked in a stalemate, it would be extremely difficult to defeat this divine grievance beast. Yi Xian could not even be bothered to summon the 1,000 beast sword servants or the divine flower sword servants. Yi Xian knew very well that they would not be of much use even if they were summoned. Now, all he had to do was see how strong this divine grievance beast was. It could be said that if the mystique or nomological laws it inherited was just a little stronger, Yi Xian would not stand a chance and would be forced to use the token to teleport him away. However, how could Yi Xian bear to leave? The Godslayer was pulled out while Yi Xian quickly thought of a countermeasure. There were many buildings on this broken continent. Clearly, its original owner had made this place very beautiful. However, it was also because it was so unique that it showed the resentment in this person's heart. Yi Xian did not know why this person had fallen, but Yi Xian knew that this person was filled with resentment even though he had fallen. Unfortunately, so what if it was so beautiful? There was no sunlight or life in the ancestral land. There was nothing. No matter how beautiful it was only for one person to admire it alone. Of course, Yi Xian was not observing this to guess the person's thoughts before he died. Yi Xian just wanted to see if he could make use of the terrain. Unfortunately, Yi Xian was disappointed. There was nothing here. Yi Xian silently observed his surroundings. The divine grievance beast was also silently observing Yi Xian. Moreover, although it had completely locked onto Yi Xian, as long as Yi Xian did not make any moves, it would not attack Yi Xian. Yi Xian finally gave up on the idea of making use of the terrain after carefully inspecting his surroundings. It looked like he could only force his way in this time. If he could kill this divine grievance beast, Yi Xian would be able to obtain a lot of benefits. At the same time, he could continue his exploration. However, if he failed, there would be nothing left. Whoosh! Following Yi Xian's order, Megatron instantly transformed and controlled the 2 Godslayer swords to charge at the divine grievance beast. A perfect hit. However, Yi Xian wasn't happy at all. This was because the God-slaying sword directly passed through the God's resentment beast's body without causing the slightest bit of damage. Yi Xian frowned. This guy was actually immune to physical damage. God-slaying slash. In an instant, Wei Zhentian controlled the 2 God-slaying swords to launch the deity-slaying slash. Boom! 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 All of them hit the mark. This time there was indeed a reaction, but the effect was not as good as expected. The deity-slaying slash cut the divine resentment beast into several pieces, but in the blink of an eye, it actually fused back together. Damn it! A law divine bow immediately appeared in Yi Xian's hand. Without hesitation, he fired an arrow. This time Yi Xian had used a divine talisman. Its attack method was fire. In an instant, the divine talisman exploded, and a huge flame surrounded the divine grievance beast. However, when the flame was extinguished, Yi Xian was shocked to find that there was still no effect. Yi Xian launched 3 attacks in a row. The first 2 were directly ignored by the God's resentment beast, but this third time, it finally angered the God's resentment beast. The God's resentment beast suddenly moved, and one of its hands rapidly grew longer and larger, arriving beside Yi Xian in an instant. Boom! Yi Xian was sent flying by a punch. Fortunately, Yi Xian was now protected by the God-slaying armor, so he didn't suffer too much damage. However, this punch also showed Yi Xian the power of the divine spirit beast. It could be said that Yi Xian couldn't defend himself at all. No, this couldn't go on. Yi Xian didn't want to stay here or leave immediately. Gritting his teeth, Yi Xian rushed over again and activated Infinite Blink. At the same time, he activated the Eternal Night Domain. Although Yi Xian didn't know if the Eternal Night Domain could trap the Divine Spirit Beast, he could only try. Then Yi Xian attacked with Absolute Zero again. All of this depended on the effect of Absolute Zero. He didn't know if the Divine Spirit Beast was careless, or if it was really affected by the Eternal Night Domain. In any case, Absolute Zero actually trapped the Divine Spirit Beast. Good chance. Yi Xian suddenly moved. He pulled the string of the Law Divine Bow in his hand without hesitation. The Law Divine Arrow. At that time, Yi Xian would see if he could still condense this fellow's body once again if he swallowed it into an unknown void. However, Yi Xian had only just released his first arrow when he saw that Absolute Zero was already starting to crack. This was Absolute Zero. Could it be that this guy could break free from it? Yi Xian didn't have time to think. He pulled the string of his bow as fast as he could. Divine arrows of law devouring shot towards the God Resentment Beast one after another. Boom! A black vortex appeared. Yi Xian could clearly see that the divine spirit beast was constantly being sucked away by the black gas. It turned out that the divine spirit beast's body was actually this black gas. Although it looked like a physical body on the surface, that was only because it was too condensed. One attack after another was launched. Although the god's resentment beast managed to break free from Absolute Zero's control in the end, several black vortexes had already condensed around it. Yi Xian intentionally spread these law-devouring divine arrows all over the god's resentment beast. At the moment, those vortexes were constantly swallowing the divine spirit beast's black gas. Although the divine spirit beast's body didn't shrink, it was obvious that its body wasn't as condensed as before. Ding! System notification. The target's realm has decreased. Currently, the target is a low-level 9th grade divine king. Losing the black gas could actually cause the divine spirit beast's realm to decrease? Yi Xian was slightly stunned. This was a situation he had never encountered before. Of course, no matter the reason, as long as the divine spirit beast's strength was weakened, it was a good thing for Yi Xian. However, it seemed like Yi Xian wasn't a match for a low-level 9th grade divine king. Yi Xian didn't have any trump cards left. He was only left with conventional means of attack. Fortunately, the Law Divine Arrow was still effective against the Divine Spirit Beast. Absolute Zero. Yi Xian didn't hesitate and attacked with Absolute Zero again. Since the combination of Absolute Zero and the Law Divine Arrow could effectively weaken the Divine Spirit Beast, Yi Xian naturally wouldn't give up on using this method. Bam! Suddenly, the Divine Spirit Beast's body expanded. At the same time, 5 of its hands attacked Yi Xian. Obviously, Yi Xian had angered it. Bam bam bam. Yi Xian was hit continuously. If it wasn't for the protection of the God Slayer armor, this series of attacks would have been enough to take Yi Xian's life. This guy wasn't affected by the Eternal Night Domain at all. The reason why he was able to trap Yi Xian with Absolute Zero the first time was because he didn't care about Yi Xian at all. Now that he had angered the Divine Spirit Beast, the success rate of Absolute Zero would obviously decrease. Fortunately, he could still hit him occasionally. Yi Xian was bleeding from the corner of his mouth. This guy was too difficult to deal with. Apart from using the Law Divine Arrow, Yi Xian couldn't find any other way to deal with the Divine Spirit Beast. This battle had become a battle of perseverance. Either Yi Xian could weaken the Divine Spirit Beast to its lowest level and kill it first, or Yi Xian would be trapped by the Divine Spirit Beast. Chapter 2392. Divine Seal Race. The only thing that puzzled Yi Xian was that the Divine Seal Race hadn't used any special ability at all. It had only used pure physical attacks. According to the system's introduction, a Divine Resentment Beast could inherit a special ability or law power from a fallen god emperor. However, the Divine Resentment Beast that Yi Xian was facing didn't have any. Of course, even if that was the case, Yi Xian still had a hard time dealing with it. If it had really inherited a special ability, Yi Xian probably wouldn't have been able to withstand it. The battle lasted for 7 days. During these 7 days, Yi Xian relied on the defense of the God Slayer armor to withstand the Divine Resentment Beast's attacks. After that, he constantly looked for opportunities to activate Absolute Zero, before using the Law of Devouring Divine Sword to weaken the Divine Resentment Beast. Finally, on the 7th day, Yi Xian successfully used the Law of Devouring Divine Arrow to destroy the Divine Resentment Beast. There was no concept of time in the progenitor realm. After all, there were no other sources of light other than the willow, the wisps. After defeating the Divine Resentment Beast, it was finally time to reap the rewards. When Yi Xian saw the Universal Calamity Crystal Core, he hesitated. Who should he give this Universal Calamity Divine Crystal to? According to the system, it could be used to strengthen sword servants, or it could be used to devour. It could be said that both options had their own advantages. For a moment, Yi Xian couldn't make up his mind, so he put it away for the time being. He planned to make his choice after leaving the progenitor realm. Time flew. Soon 30 years had passed. During these 30 years, there wasn't much happening in the Jiufeng 60,000 territories. However, the Master God battlefield had also entered a stalemate. All the major factions in the Jiufeng Divine Territory knew that Yi Xian had made a great contribution in the Master God arena, and was rewarded by the Divine Master to enter the progenitor realm to search for treasures. Therefore, no one dared to cause trouble at this time. After all, when Yi Xian left, It was equivalent to the Divine Master personally helping to supervise the Jiufeng's 60,000 territories. Yizong's development was also progressing step by step. Although it was only 30 years in the God realm, 30 years and 3 years didn't make much of a difference. On this day, Yixian finally came out. He was battered and exhausted, but his expression was one of ecstasy. This was because after Yixian had dealt with the god's resentment beast, he had immediately encountered the God Emperor's remnant consciousness. Furthermore, the system had notified him that he could tame it into his Dharma form. The special ability of the 10,000 Venerables bloodline was the 10,000 Venerables. How could Yixian let go of that Dharma form that could be subdued into the 10,000 Venerables? During these 30 years, Yixian had continuously searched the ancestor realm. However, the remnant thoughts of the Divine Emperor were extremely rare, so he had only subdued 3 Dharma aspects and fused them into the bloodline of the 10,000 sovereigns. The Dharma idols had a cooldown time, but Yixian had obtained 3 Dharma idols at once, which was equivalent to obtaining 3 trump cards. How could he not be excited? In addition, in the process of searching for the remnant spirit, Yixian also discovered a lot of resources. In 30 years, Yixian hadn't increased his cultivation base at all. However, the resources he had obtained were enough to make him extremely happy. On this day, when Yixian came out of the ancestor realm, no one noticed him. Yixian didn't hesitate and quickly rushed back to Yizong. However, before arriving at Yizong, Yixian first encountered Fei Yan. To be precise, while Yixian was rushing, Fei Yan appeared behind him out of thin air. "Young master, you're out." Fei Yan looked at Yixian and said with a smile. Yixian wasn't surprised at all that Fei Yan could appear beside Yixian out of thin air. However, at this time, he had clearly returned to Yizong, so why did Fei Yan come over in advance? Therefore, Yixian also smiled and said, "Could it be that something has happened in the 90,000 60,000 realms? Why did you come to find me in advance?" "Young master, please rest assured that everything is fine in the 90,000 realms. This little girl came here in advance to let young master move to my clan settlement first so that young master can make arrangements. So that's how it is. Very well, lead the way." Before Yixian participated in the Overgod battle stage, Fei Yan had gone to look for his clansmen. In the blink of an eye, 30 years had passed, so Fei Yan had naturally brought his clansmen over. In fact, Fei Yan's clansmen and the Divine Talisman race's Xianxian tribe were currently living together. Because of the uniqueness of the two clans, they had set up a mysterious formation. Even in the 90,000 realms, very few people knew their location. However, many of the Divine Talisman race's clansmen had already joined Yizong, because joining Yizong gave them a reasonable reason to go out and train. Yixian was the sect master of Yizong, and at the same time, he was the honorary great elder of the Xianxian tribe. Naturally, the Xianxian tribe didn't have any objections to joining Yizong. However, Fei Yan's clansmen were a little difficult to arrange. In fact, Fei Yan's clansmen weren't simple. Surprisingly, they were the powerful and mysterious Divine Sealing clan. In the God realm, many people knew about the legends of the Divine Sealing clan. However, most of the Divine Sealing clan members had already fallen during the ancient era, and the remaining Divine Sealing clan members were used by various forces, so their numbers were constantly decreasing. Currently, there weren't many survivors of the Divine Sealing clan. Fei Yan's clansmen only had a little more than 3,000, but they were already considered a relatively large tribe in the Divine Sealing clan. Of course, the Divine Sealing clan was undoubtedly a spiritual god race, but this race's innate talent was sealing. This was an incomparably powerful power, and there was no need to cultivate it. As long as one was a clansman of the Divine Sealing clan, they could automatically learn it. They called it the Life Seal. Once the Life Seal was activated, any life form in the designated area would instantly lose a certain amount of lifespan and cultivation. This was the terrifying part of the Divine Sealing clan. Their innate talent was simply terrifying to countless people. However, this race's innate talent was sealing. Sealing was also a mysterious side profession. It was the same as Divine Talisman Master, Array Master, Weapon Refiner, and so on. However, sealing didn't take people's lives but sealed them. The Divine Sealing clan possessed many strange sealing techniques, and the most well-known one was their God Seal one-word Divine Spark. In other words, a single sentence could seal an expert's godhead, making them unable to use even half of their divine power. This was the terrifying part of the divine sealing clan. Many years ago, the clansmen of Fei Yan had been taken care of by Yi Xian's cheap master, the ancient divine emperor. Then they found a secret place to recuperate. However, after the ancient divine emperor mysteriously passed away, the clansmen of Fei Yan were also wiped out, just like the other forces that relied on the ancient divine emperor. This time when Yi Xian rose again, they naturally came to seek shelter without hesitation. In their hearts, Yi Xian might only be a provincial governor of the 9 directions 60,000 territories now, but his future achievements definitely wouldn't be this small. When Yi Xian arrived at the Divine Talisman Race and Divine Sealing Clan settlement, Yi Xian didn't expect that the two clans would get along so well. They even joined forces to prepare a sealing divine talisman. Of course, Yi Xian didn't care about what they did. This time, Yi Xian planned to bring the two clans into the Yi sect. The Yi sect had its own secret realm, and Yi Xian's intention was very simple. He wanted to give the two clans a secret realm that was independent of each other. This way they would be safer. After all, the Yi sect was Yi Xian's nest, so the degree of safety was naturally much higher. Chapter 2393. Translator. Atlas Studios Editor. Atlas Studios searching for the Annihilation Organization. Of course, there would be many changes in 30 years. Although it would not have much of an impact on the Kunlun God domain or the Master God battlefield, there would still be some small movements within the Jufang 60,000 territories. Yi Xian had just returned to the Yi sect when someone reported to him that in the past decade, there had been a continuous influx of mysterious forces within the Jufang 60,000 territories. This force had seized large amounts of rare resources and ores, various secret realms, snatched devourers, invaded the border regions, and even directly robbed small sects and so on. Before Yi Xian left, he had specially instructed to observe the situation within. Therefore, when the information was gathered, Yi Xian understood who was causing trouble. If it was not the Annihilation Organization, who else could it be? This Annihilation Organization was really like a lingering spirit. As long as they could find an opportunity, they would not let it go. This Annihilation Organization would always think of ways to increase their strength. However, the Annihilation Organization, which Yi Xian had thought to be incomparably powerful, was now no different from bandits in Yi Xian's eyes. Yi Xian's first order of business was to prepare to deal with this Annihilation Organization. At the very least, he would make sure that the Annihilation Organization would disappear completely within the Jufang 60,000 territories. Pass down the order. Tell all sects in the Jufang 60,000 territories to prepare. In 10 days, the entire realm will act together and exterminate these ants. Yi Xian gave the order. As the supreme ruler of the Jufang 60,000 territories, he had the right to mobilize the forces of the entire Jufang 60,000 territories for his own use. Following Yi Xian's order, countless sects, clans, cities, and other forces quickly moved. Because Yi Xian had promised that rewards and punishments would be carried out according to the military merit system for this operation, he would naturally receive the support of all forces. The military merit system had been in place for 30 years. Many people and many forces had benefited from it. Thus, no one would refuse such a good thing as military merit if they moved within the 9 directions and 60,000 territories. 10 days later, a 30,000-strong army set out from Yi Xian's headquarters. Of course, the number of people moving at the same time was even greater, so much so that Yi Xian couldn't count them all. The number varied from a few 100,000 to a few hundred. Every power sent out their own troops, hoping to gain some benefits from this operation. The Extermination Organization, the organization that had troubled Yi Xian ever since Yi Xian entered the God realm. This time Yi Xian was going to teach them a lesson. Countless experts set out, destroying the strongholds of the organizations one after another. Of course, some organizations might not be destroyed, but as long as they had bad records this time they would all be cleaned up. The target of Yi Xian's 30,000-strong army was the so-called headquarters. One had to know that these 30,000-strong army were all experts at the divine sovereign realm and above. A portion of them were experts sent by various forces, while the rest were soldiers that Yi Xian had exchanged from the ancient Zither space through the military force distribution system. A large group of fierce soldiers charged directly into their target, Mount Fengtian. Mount Fengtian was a huge mountain range that housed many divine beasts. At the same time, the environment was extremely harsh, so very few people would come here. However, it was also because of this that extermination had chosen this place as their headquarters. The headquarters of the entire Jiufang 60,000 territories. The extermination organization thought that hiding here and executing their plan was perfect, but they didn't know that Yi Xian had long viewed them as a thorn in his side. They thought that Yi Xian was a trusted regional governor, so his control over the entire Jiufang 60,000 territories wasn't as lax as other regional governors. However, they underestimated Yi Xian's methods, as well as the support that Divine Master Mi Yan had for Yi Xian. In the past 30 years, Yi Xian had clearly not been here, but because of his previous arrangements and Mi Yan's strong support, the entire Jiufang 60,000 territories had already submitted to him. Lord Regional Governor, this is the place. According to our intelligence, the headquarters of those people is here. Resources are constantly being plundered from various territories, and according to our intelligence, they will all be sent to Mount Fengtian, a guide said to Yi Xian. He was specifically in charge of tracking this matter, so he had a relatively clear grasp of the extermination organization's information. All right. I understand. Take 20,000 men and surround this place. Don't miss any important junctions. I will personally lead my men in. Yes, Lord Regional Governor. Since Yi Xian wanted to uproot the extermination organization, he naturally wouldn't let a single one of them go. 20,000 men seemed to be a small number. However, it also depended on the cultivation base of these 20,000 men. At the very least, 20,000 divine lords were not weak. After arranging everything, Yi Xian led the remaining 10,000 men into Mount Fengtian. Clearly, the extermination organization knew that they were about to face a great disaster. However, they didn't have the chance to escape now. So they set up countless defenses in hopes that they could stop Yi Xian. Not long after Yi Xian entered Mount Fengtian, he was attacked. More than 100,000 totemic beasts, coordinated with hundreds of thousands of extermination members, launched an attack on Yi Xian. It was a pity that they were so weak. Yi Xian waved his hand, and 5,000 experts immediately moved out. It didn't take long for the hundreds of thousands of people to be wiped out. Just these ants wanting to stop Yi Xian seemed to be too naive to annihilate the organization. As they advanced, Yi Xian's goal was clear as day. He was going to find the headquarters of the extermination organization. This was the headquarters of the extermination organization, so it was impossible to say that there were no experts guarding it. In fact, the headquarters was guarded by the 4 heavenly kings. The 4 heavenly kings were quite strong. They were actually 4 divine emperor experts. Divine emperor experts were considered strong, but unfortunately, they were going against the entire Jiufang 60,000 territories. Yi Xian brought a total of 30 divine emperor experts this time. This was because Yi Xian already knew the true strength of this place, so he didn't conscript more experts. If Yi Xian was willing, not to mention 30 divine emperors, even if he could get 30 divine sovereigns, it wouldn't be impossible to gather them all. In the Jiufang 60,000 territories, the leaders of the large forces were basically godly venerable experts. As long as Yi Xian offered them some benefits, they would definitely come immediately. As for the benefits that Yi Xian needed to give, it was actually just an official position. Of course, Yi Xian didn't need to use those people at the moment, just the divine emperor experts would be enough. The army advanced quickly. In just a few days, they had arrived at the headquarters of the extermination organization. Who are you? Why are you attacking the extermination organization? A divine emperor expert of the extermination organization led his men to block Yi Xian's path and shouted at Yi Xian. Chapter 2394. Operation Cleanup. Upon hearing the voice, the heavenly king immediately focused his gaze on Yi Xian. When he saw Yi Xian, his expression changed drastically. How could he not know Yi Xian if he had chosen to set up his headquarters in the Jiufang 60,000 realms? After all, Yi Xian was the true master of the Jiufang 60,000 realms. So it's the esteemed provincial governor who has graced us with his presence. May I know how my sect has offended you? If there's anything that has upset you, my sect is willing to compensate you accordingly. The heavenly king's expression changed slightly, and he immediately spoke respectfully to Yi Xian. Unfortunately, he had encountered Yi Xian and not any other provincial governor. Annihilation's methods would not work on Yi Xian. The annihilation organization adopted the same strategy no matter where they were. They would do everything possible to plunder the resources of remote areas. They would use all kinds of methods to infiltrate the resource production areas of powerful areas and then gather these resources. If they provoked the people in power there, they would not be happy. If they were displeased, they would take out huge amounts of resources to curry favor with those in power. This would cause those in power to turn a blind eye to them. After all, even a provincial governor could not truly control his own territory completely. Therefore, those disobedient powers in those areas that were worthless in the eyes of the provincial governor would naturally not exchange them for benefits from annihilation. However, Yi Xian was not like anyone else. Yi Xian's goal was extremely clear. He wanted to completely eradicate annihilation. Alright, cut the crap. Kill them all. Don't leave a single one alive. Yi Xian casually waved his hand and gave the order to attack. The Heavenly King never expected that Yi Xian would not even give him a chance to negotiate. Helpless, he could only lead the members of Annihilation to resist. But was there any use? No matter what they used, it was useless in front of Yi Xian. These were 10,000 powerhouses at the Divine Lord realm and above. The Yao gods that Annihilation had summoned with great difficulty were killed one by one, and the members of Annihilation were surrounded and annihilated one by one. Countless resources and totem beasts were snatched back. As for the headquarters of the Annihilation organization, it was directly breached. Just as Yi Xian had said, he had issued a kill order. As long as it was someone from the Annihilation organization, Yi Xian would not spare them. This was because Yi Xian knew very well that keeping them around would only be a disaster. 3 of the 4 heavenly kings were quickly killed. The remaining heavenly kings knew that they were no match for these masters, so they gave the order to break out of the encirclement. Unfortunately, what awaited them outside were 20,000 experts. The purge of the entire Jiufeng 60,000 realms only lasted for a mere 3 months. However, it allowed Yi Xian to kill close to 30 million members of the extermination organization from the 60,000 territories. Some of these members were very weak, but of course there were also strong ones. At the same time, they killed more than 100,000 ancient demon gods that were resurrected by the Annihilation organization. They had rescued nearly 2 million captives from the Annihilation organization. At the same time, they had harvested countless resources, totem beasts, magical equipment, and more. They had also seized nearly 300 resource points from the Annihilation organization. It could be said that in just one operation, there were no more traces of the Annihilation organization in the Jiufeng 60,000 realms. However, Yi Xian was not satisfied at all. After that, he formed more than 100 so-called recovery teams and sent them to various places in the Kunlun God domain as a law enforcer of the God domain. These recovery teams only had one mission, and that was to surround and annihilate the members of the Annihilation organization outside the Kunlun God domain. It could be said that the entire operation was very ideal. Except for one, it was the territory of another provincial governor. This provincial governor controlled the 5,000 realms and was much weaker than Yi Xian. However, he was still a proper provincial governor. Therefore, he did not allow Yi Xian's recovery team to enter, and Yi Xian could not do anything about it. As a law enforcer of the God domain, Yi Xian did not have the authority to mobilize soldiers. Provincial Governor Kuei Han, huh? I'll remember that. Order everyone to withdraw. However, keep an eye on Kuei Han's 5,000 realms and collect as much evidence as possible. I'd like to see how long this provincial governor Kuei Han can protect those people. Yi Xian said calmly. Soon the army returned to Jiufeng 60,000 gathering. However, they secretly left behind countless intelligence points. They even arranged an intelligence point in each of Kuei Han's 5,000 realms. Provincial Governor Kuei Han, thank you so much this time. Otherwise, my Annihilation organization would have been wiped out by Yi Xian. An elder handed 5 Qian Kuan rings to Provincial Governor Kuei Han. These 5 Qian Kuan rings were naturally filled with resources. Provincial Governor Kuei Han smiled as he took the 5 Qian Kuan rings. However, he said calmly, Sect Leader Annihilation, what are you talking about? Yi Xian is abusing his authority to avenge a personal grudge. How could he treat my Annihilation organization like this? Since you guys have entered my Kuei Han territory, then you can rest assured. I don't believe that Yi Xian would dare to reach into my territory. Don't worry. We are both provincial governors, so we have the same authority. During the Divine Domain War, He won't dare to do anything unless he doesn't want to live anymore. Kuei Han was full of confidence. He felt that he was a provincial governor, so no matter what Yi Xian did, he wouldn't dare to go against him. Unfortunately, he underestimated Yi Xian. The intelligence points left by Yi Xian continuously sent information to Yi Zong, who then summarized the information. Provincial Governor Kuei Han was really a tyrant. In his situation, whether it was the sex or the gods, they were all divided into 3 classes by him. He was naturally in the first class and enjoyed countless privileges. The second class was the forces that submitted to him. These forces might not get many benefits, but at least they would not be exploited. However, as for the third class, which was the forces that were unwilling to associate with Kuei Han, they were miserable. It could be said that almost half of their income would be taken away by Kuei Han using various excuses, and every time there was a situation where the forces were called out, it would be these forces that would provide all the manpower. Yi Xian continued to collect information, but Kuei Han had done too many bad things. It was to the point that Yi Xian didn't need to deliberately collect information to obtain enough information. Thus, a report was sent directly to Mi Yan. In fact, the Kunlun Divine Domain didn't have many rules. After all, not just the Kunlun Divine Domain, even the entire Divine Domain worshipped the strong. However, the strongest person in the Kunlun Divine Domain was Mi Yan, and the Divine Domain was the Divine Domain. Thus soon, a group of Divine Palace Guards followed Yi Xian to Kuei Han's Divine Domain. Without giving Kuei Han any chance to explain, the guards immediately captured him. Resist? Kuei Han didn't have the guts to do so because this time, dozens of Divine Palace Guards sent by Mi Yan had higher cultivation than Kuei Han. After the guards captured Kuei Han, Yi Xian didn't hesitate to give the order to clean up Kuei Han. Chapter 2395. Entering the battlefield of the Overgods. At this point, Yi Xian's operation against annihilation was a complete success. Perhaps in the eyes of others, Yi Xian's actions were strenuous and unrewarding, but Yi Xian knew that he had to do it. Of course, Yi Xian would definitely reap some benefits while encircling annihilation. Those divine beast corpses were of no use to him anyway, so Yi Xian would not be using them for his own personal use. Therefore, Yi Xian's cultivation base had risen to superior grade 3 Godly King. It could be said that Yi Xian was very satisfied with such a quick level notification. After all, it was no longer that easy to level up after entering the Godly King realm. The resources required for devouring, as well as the quality of divine beasts, would increase tremendously. Annihilation might still have some remaining forces in the Kunlun Divine Domain, but they were no longer a force to be reckoned with. Coupled with Yi Xian's encirclement, it could be said that annihilation no longer had a foothold in the Kunlun Divine Domain. However, there was still no notification from the system, which made Yi Xian realize that annihilation probably still had some powerful forces in other divine domains. The peaceful life did not last long. Yi Xian seized the time to recruit soldiers because he knew very well that the battlefield of the Overgods was the most important thing for him to face in the coming days. Just as Yi Xian expected, Misu was recruiting soldiers again because the demon god domain had sent reinforcements again. Clearly, something big was going to happen. Yi Xian did not hesitate at all. He recruited 1 billion soldiers and 20,000 godly lords and above cultivators in one go and headed straight for the battlefield of the Overgods. This time Yi Xian wanted to go personally. Although there was no rule saying that a provincial governor had to personally command his own army, Yi Xian wanted to go and take a look at the battlefield of the Overgods. It took more than half a year for the massive army to be transported to the battlefield of the Overgods. After all, there were just too many people. It was not Yi Xian's first time at the battlefield of the Overgods. In fact, he had lived in the air above the battlefield of the Overgods for a long time. However, a battlefield of Overgods without battle and a battlefield of Overgods with battle were two completely different matters. Yi Xian quickly arrived at his camp. Many people were surprised by Yi Xian's arrival. Of course, the fact that Yi Xian had brought 20,000 experts with him was very inspiring. Kuan Buyu had already entered the Overgods battlefield. When he saw Yi Xian arrive, he immediately began to explain the situation of the Overgods battlefield to Yi Xian. Lord Regional Commander, the main battlefield of our Jiufeng 60,000 territories is a 100,000 kilometer long city wall, as well as 1,000 cities behind it. Apart from that, there are also 108 resource points and 1 pill resource point. Outside the city walls, we have 68 outpost cities and 6 strongholds. Resource sites, cities, fortresses, and city walls were the core components of the entire battlefield. Yes, I can understand the city walls, cities, and fortresses, but what about the resource points? Asked Yixian. He really did not understand this. Lord Regional Commander, due to the frequent battles on the battlefield of the overgods, the divine power is generally more violent. Only in the cities with protective barriers can the soldiers cultivate and rest in peace. As for the resource points, as the name suggests, they are places where resources are collected. When the battlefield of the overgods was first established, special barriers were deliberately set up. The battlefield of the overgods produces thousands of special resources. These resources require a lot of special substances such as blood of gods. Only the battlefield of the overgods fulfills these conditions. These resources are very effective for raising the level of the soldiers. However, they are evenly distributed in the middle of the battlefield. Therefore, if you want to obtain the resource points, you have to send soldiers to snatch them. Moreover, you have to guard against the enemy's counterattack. As for the elixir resource points, it's because of the special divine fire and divine power that can increase the effects of elixir refinement by several times. It can be said that all of our soldiers in the 9 directions 60,000 territories rely on those places for elixir refinement. Yixian nodded. In reality, he knew very well why this was the case. This was because both the soldiers and the generals had already made up their minds to enter the battlefield of the overgods. Therefore, almost no one would bring too many resources with them. Moreover, even if they did bring them, this was the battlefield of the overgods. The consumption of resources was unimaginable. Therefore, resource points became the focus of the battle. It could be said that many times true conflicts would erupt because of resource points. Both sides had a huge wall. That huge wall was the key to victory. There were countless cities behind the huge wall. However, those cities could only provide garrisons and recuperation. They could not provide resources at all. If you wanted to obtain resources, you had to charge into the buffer zone outside the walls of both sides. In that case, conflict was unavoidable. Fortunately, there were also cities and fortresses in the buffer zone, which would be of great use to them. These cities and fortresses would be garrisoned with enough soldiers. Their purpose was to protect their own resource points. In addition, Regional Governor, there are 5 magic treasure resource points in the center of the battlefield. These magic treasure resource points are the key to the battle. These magic treasure resource points will automatically produce an ancient magic treasure every month. It can be said that the battle for these magic treasure resource points is the most brutal time of the battle. Also, there are some random resources. No one knows how these random resources appear, but once they appear, it will undoubtedly lead to war immediately. Kuan Buyu continued. Yixian nodded. This was the battlefield of the overgods. There were various laws and powers. It was already somewhat chaotic. Once the battlefield of the overgods opened, no resources would be missed. There were many other areas outside the battlefield. However, neither side would explore those areas. After all, those areas were more dangerous. It was only during this period of rest that some soldiers would search for treasures together. It was not that they would not obtain anything, but they would not necessarily obtain a lot. After Yixian had a rough understanding of the battlefield of the overgods, he began to think carefully. He now had a rough understanding of the situation on the battlefield of the overgods. Usually, when there was no order from the overgods, they would just snatch resource points from each other to strengthen themselves. However, once the overgods gave the order, a large-scale battle would erupt. The rules of the battle were very clear. If one wanted to strengthen oneself, one had to snatch resource points. Otherwise, staying on the walls was equivalent to courting death. That's right. Kuan Buyu, where do the materials for refining pills come from? Do they also come from resource points? Chapter 2396. Translator. Atlas Studios Editor. Atlas Studios attacking resource points. Yixian nodded again. Then what about the treasures? What happens if the treasures of the soldiers are damaged? The cities where we are stationed can provide places to refine magical equipment, but most of the time, they are obtained from resource points or captured enemies. The other thing is the strongholds. Every stronghold can be said to be very suitable for refining magical equipment. After Yi Xian understood the situation on the battlefield of the Masters of Gods, he did not hesitate and immediately began to analyze the situation. System, can you help me allocate troops accurately? I need to transfer troops to attack more resource points. Ding! System notification. Analyzing data. Allocation failed. Ding! System notification. The system does not have the ability to analyze the allocation of troops. The host is advised to make his own arrangements. Well, the main function of the system was to increase one's strength. In such a large-scale battle, Yi Xian could not rely too much on the system. Yi Xian studied the map carefully. The map was huge. After all, the battlefield of the Masters of Gods was huge. However, Yi Xian realized that the resource points that he occupied in the 9 directions and 60,000 realms were a little thin. Therefore, the first stage of his plan was to seize the resource points. Naturally, it would not be easy to take the resource points of his own people. Therefore, Yi Xian could only target the demon god realm. Men, pass down my order. Gather the troops. What is the provincial commander preparing to do? Did the divine master not give the order to fight? Are you preparing to? An expert looked at Yi Xian in surprise. He did not understand what Yi Xian was thinking. We have so many people, but we are guarding 100 resource points. Do you think that is enough? That is not enough. Since it is not enough, why can't we seize it? Go and gather the troops. I want to take over this resource point. Yi Xian pointed casually. Although it was just a simple point, he had circled 100 resource points. The strongholds, resource points, cities, and so on of the sovereign god battlefield were all nameless. Following Yi Xian's orders, 50 million soldiers and 10,000 divine lord powerhouses gathered together. General Yi Xian's orders were very clear. This battle was only for the sake of snatching resource points. As for the benefits of obtaining resource points, there was probably no one who did not understand. Every additional resource point obtained meant that everyone would be able to get a greater share of the loot. In reality, due to the severe shortage of resource points, the allocation of resources had always been only given to those who had made contributions. Moreover, they had to have made great contributions. Many of the soldiers and even the experts had been on the battlefield of the sovereigns for so many years, but they had never been allocated a single resource. This time, the people selected by Yi Xian were those who had not received any resources at all. Yi Xian promised them that he would reward them with half of the resource points inventory as a reward. Although they were afraid that there would not be many left after the attack, it still made many people excited. In order to take over a resource point, the most important thing was to take over the city next to the resource point. The cities on the battlefield of the sovereigns were all reinforced with special laws. It could be said that there was no way to destroy them. Kill them. Following Yi Xian's orders, everyone instantly attacked. In the sky and on the ground, countless soldiers rushed up. As for Yi Xian, he also leaped into the air and charged forward. Countless enemies immediately flew out from the city. These enemies of the demon god domain were from a strange race with a pair of black wings. System, what race is this? Ding! System notification. Target set. Nether crane race. The nether crane race came from the nether region of the demon god domain. They had a special ability, nether affinity, which increased the speed at which they comprehended nether laws. The nether crane race? Then Yi Xian would start with them. Kill. Charge. Following the deafening roar, the soldiers of the 60,000 territories from all directions quickly clashed with the enemies of the nether crane race. At the same time, Yi Xian also charged into the battlefield. Wei Zhentian magic treasure form appear. Wei Zhentian controlled the 200 god-slaying swords and directly charged into the enemy. Just like Yi Xian, the ordinary soldiers of the demon god domain were mostly at the true god realm. How could they withstand the attacks of the god-slaying swords? In an instant, hundreds and thousands of enemies were killed in front of Yi Xian. As for Yi Xian himself, he also drew his law god bow. Law devouring arrow. Boom! A black vortex formed. Within that area, hundreds of enemies were sucked into the vortex. Clearly, they were doomed. Puppet law god arrow. Yi Xian shot out another arrow. In an instant, hundreds of enemies lost their ability to move. Spiritual control. Thousands of enemies from the Nether Crane race immediately lost their ability to move. They aimed their weapons at their comrades who were fighting alongside them just a moment ago. 6-syllable mantra die. The 6-syllable mantra could be said to be the most powerful killing move to crush enemies below Yixian's cultivation level. Yixian casually raised his hand and an incomparably enormous mysterious force was immediately activated. As for the enemies in front of Yixian, they seemed to have been infected with a plague as they continuously fell one after another. Of course, at the same time that they fell, it also meant that they had lost their vitality. In an instant, a large area in front of Yixian was cleared. All the enemies in this area were killed. After all, Yixian was now a superior grade 3 divine king. It was easy for him to crush these ordinary soldiers. Yixian's actions naturally attracted the attention of the experts from the Nether Crane race. At this moment, hundreds of experts immediately rushed over. When one of them saw Yixian, he was pleasantly surprised. It's the enemy's provincial governor. Quick, gather the troops and kill him. As long as we kill him, the enemy will be severely injured. Who would have thought that the people from the demon god's domain would be so good at gathering intelligence? They could recognize Yixian with just one look. However, would Yixian be afraid? Be careful, provincial governor. Dozens of experts guarding Yixian immediately went up to greet him. In an instant, the two sides engaged in a fierce battle. In the distance, there were also experts from the 9 directions 60,000 realms coming over to reinforce him. The battle between the experts had turned the area into a forbidden zone for ordinary soldiers. After all, the shockwaves from the battle between the experts were enough to make the ordinary soldiers unable to bear it. Some of them might even die. A middle-aged man stood beside Yixian. This man had the highest cultivation realm among the experts brought by Yixian. He was already a medium grade 3 hierarch expert. Even in the entire Jufeng 60,000 territories, there were only a handful of ultimate gods. This hierarch expert did not take action. He stood silently beside Yixian. His current duty was to protect Yixian and prevent Yixian from being ambushed. The Nether Crane race naturally kept sending reinforcements after knowing that Yixian had appeared on the battlefield. Unfortunately, this was just a resource city. There were not many experts here. Chapter 2397. Translator. Atlas Studios Editor. Atlas Studios Translator. Atlas Studios Editor. Atlas Studios. However, the Nether Crane clan was proficient in the law of the Netherworld. Hence, several of them had sneaked up on Yixian. These people appeared without warning. Even the godly venerable rank expert beside Yixian did not notice them at all. What kind of law power is this? Yixian could not help but wonder. System, detect the law power of these people. Ding. System notification. Target has the law of silence. The law of silence could completely hide one's aura. As long as one did not actively expose themselves, no one would be able to detect them unless they used special treasures or special abilities. There was such a law power? It was impossible for Yixian not to be tempted. After all, even Yixian's wings of the gods could not hide such powerful abilities. However, the system did not notify Yixian that he could forcibly devour it. Hence, even if Yixian was tempted, there was nothing he could do. Go to hell. Suddenly, an enemy from the Nether Crane clan appeared less than 2 meters away from Yixian. As soon as he appeared, he immediately launched an attack. This person held a black ball in his hand. As he attacked Yixian, the ball began to emit a huge amount of energy. Ding! Warning! Warning! The host is under a fatal threat. The host is under a fatal threat. Ding! The system has automatically taken over authority, taking emergency defensive measures, summoning the divine martial holy turtle Dharma idol. Ding! Dharma idol destroyed. Warning deactivated. This series of changes meant that Yixian did not have time to react. In other words, if the system had not acted in time, Yixian would have died. An extremely violent wave of energy swept through the entire battlefield. Regardless of whether it was friend or foe, at least hundreds of thousands of people were killed by this wave of energy. Yixian still had lingering fears. This time it could be said that he had almost died. One had to know that the divine martial holy turtle Dharma idol was the strongest defensive Dharma idol that Yixian had obtained in the progenitor realm. This Dharma idol's only ability was its extremely strong defense. Furthermore, all the Dharma idols from the ancestral land were at the Emperor God realm. However, even such a defense was shattered after blocking the attack. One could imagine how powerful the attack was. It could be said that the experts involved in the battle were greatly affected by this attack. More than half of them were killed, and the rest were not in a good condition either. Only the godly venerable expert beside Yixian was protected by Yixian's transcendence energy, so he wasn't hurt too badly. Yixian couldn't help but ask, "What is that?" "System, what was that black ball that attacked me just now?" Ding! System notification. Target set. Sphere of Law. The Orb of Laws was a special magic treasure created by an expert by constantly compressing the power of laws and using special formations and materials to reinforce it. This artifact was a one-time explosive offensive artifact. Depending on the amount of nomological power injected into it, it would have different attack effects. Moreover, it was extremely easy to self-destruct. How could it store nomological power attacks like this? It could be said that this was simply beyond Yixian's imagination. One had to know that the power of laws was an illusory thing. It wasn't like water, fire, sand, or earth that could be stored. However, the people of the demon god realm had actually created such a thing. The power of laws could only be borrowed, so once it was used, it would disappear immediately. Yixian really couldn't understand how the people of the demon god realm had done it. How did they store the power of laws in the orb? Of course, perhaps the most important thing was the orb that stored the power of laws. That thing was the real rare treasure. Yixian finally understood the dangers of the battlefield. It could be said that the moment he appeared on the battlefield, he was no doubt a piece of fat meat in the eyes of the enemy. The enemy would probably do everything in their power to kill him. After all, Yixian was a provincial governor. Once Yixian was killed, it would be a huge blow to the morale of the people of the Jiufeng Divine Realm. Following the failure of the orb's attack, it also announced that the Nether Crane clan was no longer able to withstand the attacks of the Jiufeng Divine Realm. After a while, Yixian had already occupied a city, and very soon he had taken control of several resource points with this city as the center. It was only now that Yixian truly walked into a resource point for the first time. He carefully observed what kind of resources these resource points produced. In the battlefield of the Masters of Gods, it was naturally impossible for every resource point to produce the same resources. The resource point that Yixian had just arrived at mainly produced a type of divine power stone. This was a product that only belonged to the battlefield of the Masters of Gods. Therefore, the name was given randomly. This divine power stone was similar to ordinary divine crystals. It could directly absorb the divine power contained within. Of course, the divine power was secondary. The key was the production. It could be said that the production was shockingly high. This was because in the battlefield of the Masters of Gods, there would be people dying at every moment. When a great battle erupted, even more people would die. The battlefield of the Masters of Gods had its own rules. To put it simply, these divine power stones were formed by the condensation of the divine power of those who had died. It could be said that they were extremely bloody products. However, no one would care about this. As long as they could increase their own strength, many people would be very happy to tell those people that they had eaten the corpses of their enemies. Moreover, in the countless years of the battlefield of the Masters of Gods, there was indeed a lot of violent divine power gathered. This violent divine power could not be directly absorbed, but the divine power stones could purify it. Therefore, the divine power stones were really a good thing. In this resource point, there were many other resources besides the divine power stones. Of course, the most popular one was undoubtedly the divine power stones. Most of the divine power stones contained a single type of law energy, but occasionally there would be 2, 3, or even more types of law energy. These divine power stones also contain varying amounts of law energy. However, no matter how many there were, it was definitely good news for the ordinary soldiers. After all, this would allow them to comprehend the power of laws at close range. Back in the Kunlun realm, hundreds of thousands of geniuses were fighting for the opportunity to comprehend the laws. Of course, although the divine power stones could be used to comprehend the laws, the effects were not very good. However, as ordinary soldiers, what could they hope for? It could be said that in every war of the divine dominion, many experts would be born because of the divine power stones. Of course, the divine power stones could not leave the battlefield of the masters of gods. Once they left, they would immediately lose the power of laws contained within them. Chapter 2398. Translator. Atlas Studios Editor. Atlas Studios' stronghold. This resource point was mainly filled with various ores. Apart from God's power ores and law stones, there were also ores that could be used to forge magic treasures. After that, Yixian walked to the next resource point. Compared to the first resource point, which was a barren mountain, the second resource point was a forest. Here there were many plant resources. Naturally, the resources here could be used to refine pills. Among them, the most unique was perhaps the fruit that grew from the divine skeleton tree. The most unique thing was that the growth of the divine skeleton tree was actually related to battle. This was because the nutrients it absorbed was the killing intent on the battlefield. It could be said that as long as a battle broke out, the divine skeleton tree would grow rapidly, could even bear fruit in a few days. The divine skeleton fruit could be used to refine a very unique pill called the killing aura pill. After consuming this pill, there was no other effect other than increasing one's killing intent. Killing intent might not seem to be that important on the surface, as it did not increase one's cultivation or strength. However, this pill was the most popular on the battlefield of the overgods. This was because every time there was a battle on the battlefield of the overgods, there would be a large number of casualties. These people could not withstand the influence of the killing intent, and were either scared out of their wits or possessed by the devil. Killing intent could directly affect one's mind. No matter how strong one was, they could still be affected. On the battlefield of the overgods, there would be battles on the scale of tens or even hundreds of billions at any time. One could only imagine how dense the killing intent was. Consuming this killing aura pill could effectively prevent one's mind from being eroded by the killing intent. At the same time, it could strengthen one's killing intent. Naturally, this pill was very popular. However, the production of this pill was very limited. Yixian surveyed the resource points that he had seized. However, he did not find anything that was worthy of Yixian's interest. Of course, the total amount of resources was still very large. However, Yixian naturally could not devour them. After all, these belonged to the soldiers. Capturing a city was not enough to satisfy Yixian. Therefore, after a short rest, Yixian gave the order to battle again. However, this time Yixian would not charge at the front. After all, Yixian had just exited the sphere of law. If another one were to appear, then Yixian definitely wouldn't be able to withstand it and wouldn't be able to defend against it. Yixian led his army to take down several cities in succession. After all, with the support of 10,000 strong cultivators, how could the enemy resist? Soon, Yixian's army arrived in front of a fortress. However, at this point, Yixian had no choice but to stop. It was no longer that simple to attack the stronghold. Within the stronghold, there was an absolute air restriction. In other words, it was impossible to hope to fly into the stronghold. When attacking the stronghold, even Yixian's army could only proceed as if it was an ordinary siege. Of course, this was not the most important thing. The most important thing was the defense of the stronghold. Every stronghold had a special protective restriction or array formation. It could be said that it was not easy to take down a stronghold. However, Yixian could not give up just like that. With a wave of his hand, a vanguard of 100,000 soldiers immediately charged forward. Yixian wanted to see what kind of protective restrictions this stronghold had. Charge. Kill. 100,000 soldiers. If they attacked from the sky and on the ground, it would not seem like much. However, just charging from the ground was very impressive. Fortunately, this stronghold was large enough. Otherwise, these people would have already surrounded the stronghold. On the city walls, all kinds of attacks erupted in an instant. Lights flashed and colorful lights filled the battlefield. The strength of an individual began to seem weak on such a battlefield. Through his divine consciousness, Yixian could clearly see his charging soldiers being hit by all kinds of law power attacks and then falling. On top of the city walls, the enemy could calmly prepare one big move after another. There were even a few people or dozens of people who gathered their law powers to launch attacks. However, the siege troops below the city walls could only use their divine power shields to resist. Suddenly, 100 pillars of light descended from the sky. In an instant, hundreds of people were vaporized. Then the pillars of light began to move. Anyone who was hit by them immediately fell. What kind of attack is this? Yixian asked in surprise. Replying to the provincial governor, this is the simplest way to attack the defensive restrictions of the stronghold. We call it the light of destruction. The light of destruction is formed by the soldiers in the stronghold, imbuing their divine power into a special light of destruction. Then, the light of destruction transforms the light of destruction into a powerful energy attack. Yixian nodded. The power of the light of destruction was not simple. However, before Yixian could even take a few more glances at the god-slaying light, another attack suddenly exploded out. From within the fortress, a huge black ball suddenly flew out. When the black ball landed outside, it immediately exploded. First, a vast power directly crushed a portion of the soldiers who were attacking the fortress. Then it turned into a huge devouring ball and sucked in the surrounding people. This attack was very similar to Yixian's divine arrow of destruction, except that it was hundreds of times larger. Boom! 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 Following a few loud noises, several extremely powerful Dharma idols appeared on the battlefield. These Dharma idols were not only extremely powerful, but also very large in size. Perhaps because they were all summoned by the demon god's domain, they were generally in the shape of divine beasts. However, Yixian's close aide explained, Lord Regional Commander, this is the special Dharma protection of the stronghold. In every stronghold there are dozens to hundreds of Dharma powers. These Dharma powers are usually like statues in the stronghold, unassuming. However, once there is a battle, they can be activated to protect the stronghold. These guardian Dharma powers can only last for a few hours at most. Of course, they can be summoned back at any time. However, the cooldown time is only a few days to a dozen days. If they are summoned back quickly, the cooldown time can be even shorter. It can be said that they are very difficult to deal with. Only a few days of cooldown time. They could last for a few hours. Yixian was slightly shocked. It should be known that he could also summon Dharma powers, but the cooldown time was hundreds to thousands of years. Moreover, they could not be summoned for very long. He did not expect the guardian Dharma powers on the battlefield of the sovereigns to be so powerful. No wonder there were so few strongholds. If they were all strongholds, there would be no way to fight at all. 100,000 people, 100,000 people. However, not long after the guardian appeared, almost all of them were wiped out. Even Yixian did not have time to give the order to retreat. Chapter 2399. A bloody battle. It was no wonder that the battle of the overgods was so exhausting. It was just a fortress and it was already so terrifying. However, it was impossible for him to scare Yixian away like this. Yixian gave the order. This time it wasn't a small attack of 100,000 people but a full 10 million people. Among them, there were also 2,000 experts at the Divine Lord realm and above. The real siege had only just begun. Following Yixian's order, the crowd densely packed together and attacked the stronghold. Of course, the crowd had also prepared some engineering tools. The divine power crossbow chariots required more than 100 people to control. There was a special array inside the divine power crossbow chariot that could convert the divine power into precept power to attack the enemy. As for what precept power was converted, it was determined by the conversion array inside. Moreover, each of its attacks would definitely deal a great amount of damage. It could be said that even a Divine King expert would definitely die if they were to stand in the way of the ballista. There were many other strategic treasures like this. However, there were not many of them. The materials required for such powerful strategic treasures were imaginable. Moreover, it was extremely difficult to forge them. It could be said that there were not many of them in the entire Kunlun God realm. There were less than 100 of them in Yixian's hands. Of course, these strategic treasures were undoubtedly the main targets of the enemy. Therefore, of the 2,000 people sent by Yixian, about 1,000 were guarding these strategic treasures. Boom! It was the void-escaping dragon beast. This was a special divine beast that had mastered the precept power of space precept power. Furthermore, this divine beast was not naturally produced. Instead, it evolved from a totem beast. This was the main reason why totem beasts were brought into the battlefield in large numbers as strategic resources. Totem beasts were one of the few special divine beasts that could evolve into ancient divine beasts through special means. Although the lifespan of these ancient divine beasts was generally very short, at least it was enough for battle. Of course, not everyone knew how to do this. In fact, even Yi Xian did not know how to do this. At this time, dozens of void-escape dragon beasts from Jiufeng's 60,000 territories leaped out from the ground and pounced on the fortress wall in an instant. In an instant, the void-escape dragon beast had actually breached a hole in the walls of the stronghold. Charge! Kill! The morale of the soldiers of the 9 directions 60,000 territories was greatly boosted, and they rushed towards the gap. When these soldiers arrived at the foot of the city wall, they immediately set up a human ladder. Because of the absolute sky restriction, even if one were to jump, it would be very difficult to jump so high. Therefore, building a human ladder became the simplest and most effective method. In a short period of time, over 10,000 people had already charged up the city walls. But now that there was a gap in the wall, it naturally attracted the attention of the experts from the demon god domain. A group of experts quickly came to help, but before they could do anything, a wave of powerful attacks was launched at the soldiers below the wall. The enemy also used totem beasts. Pass down the order. Send out 500 more totem beasts. We must secure that gap. Yi Xian gave the order. Soon, another 500 totem beasts that had been nurtured to the level of ancient mythical beasts rushed over. These mythical beasts had one thing in common, and that was that they were extremely powerful. In an instant, the enemy at the gap could no longer resist and were forced to retreat. The soldiers of the 9 directions 60,000 territories naturally would not waste such a good opportunity. One by one, they continued to charge, trying to break through the enemy's line of defense with that gap as the center. But at this time, a ray of light suddenly erupted from that section of the wall, directly enveloping that section of the wall. Oh no, the enemy has activated the city wall territory. Provincial governor, quickly give the order to change the attack position. In fact, there was no need for Yi Xian to give the order. After seeing the light on the wall, the soldiers had already instinctively avoided that section of the wall. The city wall territory was a territory unique to the fortress walls. Once activated, it could instantly kill all life forms that entered it. However, the city wall territory's cooldown time was very long, so generally speaking, unless it was absolutely necessary, the defending side would not activate it. Fortunately, a portion of the 500 totem beasts that Yi Xian had sent out had already attacked the other walls, while the other portion had not yet climbed up the wall. Otherwise, they would have all been destroyed there. The city wall territory could be said to be the enemy's trump card of defense in the fortress. Of course, the enemy had used the city wall territory, which was equivalent to completely exposing that section of the wall to the 9 directions 60,000 territories. As long as the city wall territory disappeared, the soldiers of the 9 directions 60,000 territories would be able to attack that section without worry. Blood flowed as one godhead after another shattered. Battle cries filled the entire fortress. However, the surrounding enemies did not send in reinforcements, and the surrounding allies did not send in reinforcements either. This was the rule of the battlefield of the sovereigns. Once a battle broke out, both sides would only focus on their own targets. They would not easily provoke other enemies, even if other enemies were close by. It was not that anyone had decided on this tactic, but it was a common understanding. After all, the battlefield of the sovereigns was extremely vast. If chaos broke out, it would probably become a huge mess. When that happened, neither side would gain any benefits. Of course, if Yi Xian was stupid enough to transfer all the soldiers who were at the border with the other enemies, that would be a different matter. When that happened, the enemy would not be called an attack. At most, they would be considered to have taken advantage of the situation. The siege of the fortress continued for 3 months. For 3 whole months, both sides did not have a single moment of rest. Yi Xian had also been standing here for 3 whole months. Finally, the enemy troops in the fortress chose to retreat, because they did not have enough soldiers. Yi Xian did not understand why the enemy did not send in reinforcements, but Yi Xian would not give up on the fortress. Soon the army marched in. The loss of the fortress meant that the surrounding cities and resource points were completely defenseless. The people of the demon god's domain gave up on defending and allowed Yi Xian to send in his troops. Yi Xian received a large number of rewards. However, he was not satisfied. In other words, Yi Xian had a target that he had to capture. This resource point was different from other resource points in that it was a special resource point. It was a resource point guarded by 3 fortresses. Such a special resource point was rare even on the battlefield of the sovereigns. It could be said that whoever occupied this place would gain a great advantage. Of course, knowing was one thing, but being able to take it was another. In reality, such special resource points were often empty on the battlefield of the sovereigns, with no one occupying them. Chapter 2400. Resurrection Altar. After sacrificing so much to obtain this resource point, it was obvious that they would not defend it with all their might. So what could be produced here? Actually, the other resources of this resource point aside, there was one altar that everyone was envious of, because the function of this altar was resurrection. As long as one's soul was not destroyed, even if one's godhead was shattered, even if one was only left with a wisp of soul, as long as one reached this altar, one would be able to quickly resurrect. This was the terrifying thing about this altar. The power of resurrection, once used properly, could be imagined. Moreover, with this resource point, the morale of the soldiers would be greatly boosted. Before every battle, if one could promise the soldiers that they would be able to resurrect even if they died in battle, the morale of the soldiers would be greatly boosted. Of course, in order to use this altar, one would need to expend a terrifying amount of resources. However, even so, Yi Xian still wanted to take this special resource point. 3 strongholds. Moreover, these 3 strongholds were clearly more powerful than ordinary strongholds. This was because they had 2 walls and were equipped with more defensive facilities. If one wanted to take them, they would have to pay a huge price. However, when Yi Xian proposed to attack the special resource point, he didn't expect that it would be unanimously passed. To these experts, they were probably more concerned about their lives than the soldiers. After all, it was not easy for them to reach their current level of cultivation. In order to attack this special resource point, one would need a large number of soldiers. In one breath, Yi Xian directly transferred over 500 million soldiers. A total of 500 million people gathered from all over the world. It could be said that Yi Xian's actions made the various factions of the demon god's domain extremely nervous. It was rare to mobilize 100 million soldiers in a local war, let alone 500 million. Of course, as long as Yi Xian did not attack them, they would not act rashly. Just as Yi Xian was preparing to attack, a regional commander nearby sent an envoy over. This regional commander had also seen Yi Xian's actions and was extremely shocked. He immediately sent an envoy over. The envoy was basically asking why Yi Xian was mobilizing so many soldiers. Was he not afraid of attracting the attention of the 2 divine masters and causing an all-out war? Yi Xian smiled slightly but replied, "If we continue like this, won't an all-out war erupt? Since an all-out war will erupt sooner or later, why not take advantage of this opportunity to obtain more resource points?" After that, the regional commander did not send any more inquiries. Of course, even if he did, Yi Xian would not give up on his plan. On this day, it could be said that the 9 Directions 60,000 Realms had become the most eye-catching place in the entire Master God battlefield. This was because Yi Xian had launched the largest local war in the Master God battlefield. In the sky and on the ground, the black mass of soldiers was densely packed. As far as the eye could see, there was simply no end to the sea of people. Many experts were also placed in the army. This time, the purpose of the battle was to seize the special resource points and attack the 3 strongholds that were heavily guarded by the enemy at the same time. All divine masters kill. Yi Xian suddenly swung the god-slaying sword in his hand. After that, the entire sky darkened. This was because there were simply too many soldiers flying out of the sky. There were so many that the light was completely obscured. For 2 whole days, Yi Xian was shrouded in darkness. This was because only 2 days were enough for so many people to pass through. The battle was extremely intense from the very beginning. The enemy would not give up on these resource points so easily. Moreover, their experts could be revived immediately after they died. This battle was destined to be an extremely difficult one. However, Yi Xian was not determined. Just like what Yi Xian had said to the regional commander, if he went to fight for the resource points now, it would be a local battle after all. Thus, his losses would be much lower. However, if he waited until the all-out war erupted before he went to fight for the resource points, his losses would be even greater. Yi Xian would rather choose to pay a heavy price now and obtain more resource points so that the remaining soldiers could level up as much as possible. He was not willing to just wait. After all, battle achievements were everything. Only battle achievements would determine whether Yi Xian would win or lose in this over God's domain. 200 million people. A total of 200 million people had been lost on both sides. There were 30 million enemy soldiers stationed in the 3 strongholds. Almost all of them had been wiped out by Yi Xian. However, the price that Yi Xian had paid was 170 million casualties. This did not include the soldiers who had died trying to stop the enemy's reinforcements. However, Yi Xian still managed to obtain the resource points in the end. He had used an entire year to do so. However, it was only after Yi Xian obtained the resource points that many people understood Yi Xian's true intentions. At this moment, Yi Xian's resource points had actually formed a semicircle around another group of enemies. Clearly, this group of enemies were like turtles in a jar. The 3 strongholds were the best barriers. It was enough to prevent the enemy from sending reinforcements. There were a total of 200 resource points that had been encircled. Yi Xian immediately sent out an envoy and gave the enemy a choice. They could either retreat or be eliminated by Yi Xian one by one. It could be said that the enemy did not have a choice at all. They could only retreat after being hemmed in. After all, it was impossible to defend to the death. Yi Xian got what he wanted and took down the plan that he'd set, encircling a large amount of resource points. However, at the same time, he had also obtained the nickname of a tyrant on the Overgod's domain. The meaning of this nickname was very simple. It meant that Yi Xian did not cherish the lives of his soldiers at all. However, no matter what others thought, Yi Xian would only do as he wished. Moreover, the soldiers and powerhouses of the 9 directions' 60,000 territories did not feel the slightest bit of emotion. After all, obtaining so many resource points was undoubtedly a good thing for them. Batch after batch of pills were continuously produced and piles of treasures were continuously distributed to the soldiers. This caused their overall strength to rapidly increase. Yi Xian had sacrificed 200 million people in exchange for the overall strength of the remaining 1 billion or so people. This was the Overgod's domain. The growth of resources here was countless times faster than the outside world. In addition, there were many things that could not be obtained in the outside world. This was enough to make the soldiers extremely happy. In fact, more than 3 million soldiers who had contributed greatly had obtained the law stones that they had always dreamed of. Of course, whether or not they could comprehend the laws after obtaining the law stones would depend on their own efforts. After Yi Xian had obtained these resource points, he stopped the war. Instead, he focused on increasing the strength of his soldiers. There was no merit in starting a local war like this. It could be said that very few people would do such a thing. Whether it was the Kunlun god domain or the demon god domain, the various factions were all waiting. They were waiting for an all-out war to break out again. 50 years. For a full 50 years, the Overgod's domain had been extremely peaceful. Apart from the occasional local war, it was basically peaceful. However, on Yi Xian's side, there had not been a single local war in 50 years. However, 50 years was more than enough. Chapter 2401. Chaos Apocalypse Formation. Following the Divine Master's orders, the soldiers and experts of the Kunlun and Monster God domains quickly gathered. Only now did people understand what it meant to be small and insignificant. From the sky to the ground, there were people everywhere. For the first time, Mi Yan appeared on the battlefield of the sovereigns. No one knew whether this battle would determine the final outcome, but everyone knew that countless people would fall in this battle. Yi Xian stood in front of his army as a Jidushi. Behind him was a phalanx. The start of an all-out war meant that the number of soldiers was no longer in the tens of thousands, but in the hundreds of millions. Although Yi Xian was leading more than 1 billion soldiers, there were only a dozen square formations. At the same time, the all-out war began. Powerful treasures appeared on the battlefield one after another. These were all treasures of the battlefield, treasures that only appeared on the battlefield. Charge! Mi Yan waved her hand. In an instant, tens of billions of soldiers rushed out. Tens of billions of soldiers, what a terrifying number. But this was just the vanguard testing the waters. At the same time, tens of billions of soldiers rushed out to meet the enemy. This kind of battle was simply terrifying. Even the strong seemed so fragile. Yi Xian saw a mid-level divine emperor rush into the enemy formation with his own eyes. In the beginning, there was still some movement. But in a short while, that divine emperor fell silent and was drowned by the sea of people. Divine domain law enforcer, Yi Xian, heed my orders. Just as Yi Xian was observing the battle ahead, a divine palace guard came to Yi Xian's side. Yixian, heed my orders. Yixian didn't dare to hesitate and answered immediately. The guard obviously recognized Yixian. He first nodded slightly at Yixian, then said, "By the Divine Master's orders, Divine Domain Law Enforcer Yixian, quickly select 5,000 soldiers and send them to the Divine Domain Law Enforcer." Divine Domain Law Enforcer? The person in charge of the entire army? Why did Mi Yin want him to find him? But Yixian naturally wouldn't ask. "Yes, Yixian, heed my orders." After passing down the order, the guard smiled at Yixian and said, "Lord Law Enforcer, you must cherish this opportunity. The Divine Master thinks highly of you." Although Yixian was puzzled, he still smiled at the guard and said, "Brother, thank you for the reminder. To serve the Divine Master is my duty. But brother, do you know what mission the Divine Master has for me?" "Aha, you'll know once you get there. I guarantee it's a good thing." The Divine Palace Guard didn't say anything. After sending off the Divine Palace Guards, Yixian discovered that everyone around him was incomparably excited. Yixian asked, Yixian, is there a need to be so excited?" A Divine Emperor walked up to Yixian and said, "Lord Provincial Governor, you haven't participated in the Divine Domain War before, so it's not strange that you don't know. The Divine Master has given you a fat job. Didn't you notice that the other provincial governors are envious?" Needless to say, Yixian released his spiritual will and quickly saw the surrounding regional commanders. As expected, they were looking at Yixian with envious gazes. Yixian was still puzzled, but he quickly selected 5,000 soldiers and walked toward the direction of the Divine Master. It was obvious that the people chosen by Yixian were all very excited. Perhaps he was the only provincial governor who didn't know what was going on. Soon Yixian arrived at the location of the Divine Master. However, when Yixian saw the Divine Master, he was slightly surprised. That was because the dispatcher was a divine beast. Of course, the Divine Master's status was higher than Yixian's, so Yixian didn't dare show any disrespect. The provincial governor of the Divine Domain and the provincial governor of the Jiufeng 60,000 territories greets the Divine Master. Yixian said to the Divine Master in an offensive manner. The Divine Master glanced at Yixian and said, "Well, you're here. Go on. You've been assigned to the 5th district of the Chaotic World Annihilation Array. You'll be in charge there." Yixian arrived at the so-called 5th district of the Chaotic World Annihilation Array. However, when Yixian saw the thing in front of him, he couldn't help but be shocked. It was a giant sword. To be precise, the entire Chaotic World Annihilation Array was an array made up of 49 giant swords. Each of the giant swords was over 10,000 meters tall and constantly emitted powerful waves of energy. Although Yixian had never seen them before, he now understood that these giant swords were super strategic treasures. Of the 49 giant swords, 30 were directly controlled by the Divine Palace Guards, while 19 were assigned to the various provincial governors. The powerhouses around Yixian were all very excited. A high-grade Divine Emperor actually knelt on the ground and worshipped the giant sword. "System, what is this thing?" Ding! System notification. The specified target is too powerful for the system to detect. Impossible to detect? Just as Yixian was wondering how to control the Divine Master, he saw his subordinates running to their respective positions impatiently. The high-grade Divine Emperor also came to Yixian's side and said to Yixian, "Provincial Governor, the control of this Chaotic World Annihilation Giant Sword is very simple. Please go up to the main altar. There, you will decide the target position of the attack. We will be in groups of 500 and continuously inject divine power and the power of law into the Chaotic World Annihilation Giant Sword. This time we will be able to earn enough military merits." After hearing that, Yixian finally understood how to use this thing. Naturally, he didn't hesitate and walked directly to the main altar. After Yixian went up to the main altar, the altar quickly rose into the air. Ding! System notification. The host has been strengthened by an unknown power. Divine sense has been increased by 10,000 times. Ding! System notification. The host has been strengthened by an unknown power. Divine sense has been increased by 10,000 times. Ding! System notification. The host has been strengthened by an unknown power. Divine power has been increased by 10,000 times. The 3 notifications made Yixian's heart tremble violently. an increase of 10,000 times. At this time, Yi Xian directly released his divine sense. In an instant, Yi Xian felt as if the entire battlefield was in his eyes. Yi Xian could actually see the movements of the soldiers in front of him. Of course, he couldn't sense the entire battlefield, but he could sense about half of it. At the same time, 3 shadows of short swords appeared in front of Yi Xian. A divine sense was transmitted to Yi Xian's divine sense. Chapter 2402. Translator. Atlas Studios Editor. Atlas Studios 10,000 times amplification. As it turned out, the 3 daggers represented the number of times Yi Xian could attack. The experts below were constantly pouring in divine power in order to form these daggers. Of course, as for the power of these daggers, only Yi Xian would know after using them. The order to attack had yet to arrive, so Yi Xian could only silently observe the battle in front of him. A battle of 20 billion people, but it was just a probing attack. There was not even the support of a strategic treasure. This was probably something that would only appear in the Battle of the Sovereigns. Suddenly, a voice rang out in Yi Xian's ears. Zone 5 free attack once. Yi Xian was slightly taken aback. He did not expect that he would be allowed to attack once before the rest of the battle began. He did not know if Mi Yan was deliberately giving him a chance to practice. However, Yi Xian naturally would not let go of such a good opportunity. He immediately searched for a target with his divine sense. Yi Xian knew that such a strategic treasure had a large area of effect. Hence, he did not dare to use it carelessly. If he was not careful, he might end up hurting his own people. Very soon Yi Xian locked onto a position. Then, he directly activated his divine power. Yi Xian's divine power quickly fused into the Chaos Armageddon Greatsword. Suddenly, Yi Xian felt his divine sense begin to automatically lock onto the enemy. It could be said that this sudden change caught Yi Xian off guard. It was only now that Yi Xian realized that the Chaos Armageddon Greatsword actually had a weapon spirit. Yi Xian had only locked onto a single area. Clearly, this was not a suitable attack method. Hence, the Chaos Armageddon Greatsword automatically helped Yi Xian to properly lock onto the enemy. Yi Xian's divine sense quickly swept across the battlefield. Wherever his divine sense passed, countless enemies were immediately marked. Yi Xian could clearly sense these markings, but the others could not see or sense them. Yi Xian didn't even have time to count how many enemies he had locked onto. Because the time was too short, the small sword in front of Yi Xian disappeared in an instant. The Chaos Armageddon sword emitted a huge light, and then a sword shadow rushed into the sky. That sword shadow rapidly rushed towards the battlefield. However, when it reached the battlefield, it rapidly split apart. Countless sword raindrops were emitted from that chaos apocalyptic sword shadow. Their numbers were terrifying beyond compare. Boom! 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 In an instant, the entire battlefield was filled with smoke. Whether it was in the sky or on the ground, whether it was ordinary soldiers or experts, the enemies of the demon god domain were dealt an unprecedented blow. This was a real rain of swords. Countless sword shadows fell down like rain. The entire battlefield was filled with dazzling light. At this moment, life seemed so insignificant. Countless enemies tried to defend themselves, and all kinds of treasures, divine shields, and law shields appeared one after another. Unfortunately, it was useless. That was because the primal chaos apocalyptic greatsword's attack contained a special power of law. Enemies were penetrated one by one, and their divine personas shattered on the spot. All of this happened too quickly in the blink of an eye. However, Yi Xian was able to clearly see all of this because at the same time he launched his attack, he also received the support of the time laws. Yi Xian's current speed of thought was increased by 100 times. At this moment, Yi Xian was really busy. The rain of swords couldn't be ignored after it was released. In order to cause the most damage, Yi Xian had to constantly lock onto his enemies. After all, if Yi Xian didn't lock onto a new target after killing an enemy, then these sword shadows would be wasted. Even with a 10,000-fold increase in divine sense and a 100,000-fold increase in law of time, Yi Xian was still flustered. He was even feeling powerless. Many of the attacks were actually wasted. But this couldn't be helped. After all, there were just too many swords in the rain. The power of this rain of swords was definitely not small. An ordinary true God realm soldier would be able to instantly kill him with a single sword strike. Even if they were a little stronger, as long as they were locked onto by Yi Xian's divine sense, They would endlessly attack. After a while the attacks stopped. But in the enemy camp, hundreds of millions of people had died in an instant. Terrifying numbers, terrifying attacks. Was this the so-called strategic treasure? Such a powerful attack. I'm afraid that no one can withstand it. Of course, it was also quite a challenge to control. Yi Xian's control over his divine sense was already pretty good, but it also caused a lot of wastage. This was just Yi Xian's attack, and it was already so powerful. Then what would happen if all 49 swords of the Primal Chaos Apocalyptic Greatsword attacked at the same time? However, Yi Xian also knew that once the enemy activated their strategic treasure, it would probably be impossible to cause such terrifying damage. Because of this attack, the Kunlun God domain quickly gained the upper hand. But also because of Yi Xian's attack, the enemy directly launched a full-scale attack. Perhaps in Yi Xian's eyes, the attack of the Primal Chaos Apocalyptic Greatsword was already extremely powerful. But when the battle broke out, Yi Xian truly understood what a true strategic treasure was. In front of the enemy camp, tens of thousands of huge mythical beasts were charging at the forefront. Their size was definitely something Yi Xian had never seen before. Most importantly, these mythical beasts could actually use the power of the law of space at will. As long as they were willing, they could summon a teleportation portal in front of them at any time. Then, their huge bodies would enter the teleportation portal. But as for where they would appear from, no one knew. They might even appear directly in the Kunlun God domain's array. And there were many buildings built on the bodies of these mythical beasts. Countless people from the demon god domain launched attacks from these buildings. Of course, the most important thing was that each of these mythical beasts was equipped with a strategic treasure. Yi Xian did not know the name of these strategic treasures of the demon god domain. For the time being, he would just call them the Law Divine Cannons. This kind of Law Divine Cannon, the interval between each attack was not too long, but the power was quite formidable. Although they were slightly weaker than the Primal Chaos Apocalyptic Greatsword that Yi Xian was controlling, the key was that they could move. Every time the Kunlun God domain's army was struck, tens of thousands to thousands of soldiers would perish on the spot. In fact, most of them would not even leave behind a corpse. And there were tens of thousands of Law Divine Cannons like this. To be able to use the law of space at will to move to any corner of the battlefield and launch powerful attacks, these mythical beasts were extremely powerful. However, it was not as if the Kunlun God domain had no way to deal with them. A million totem beasts rushed out from the Kunlun God domain. Chapter 2403. The war was over. The moment the totem beasts appeared, they rushed out. Each time the demon god domain's colossal beast disappeared, countless totem beasts would follow suit. It could be said that the totem beasts were extremely small in size compared to the colossal beast. They were like ants in front of it. However, the totem beasts were perfect for dealing with the colossal beast. It was common to see the colossal beasts that appeared on the battlefield wailing and struggling. That was because the totem beasts had already dug into their bodies and were wreaking havoc. After that, the Kunlun God domain also introduced their own mobile strategic treasures. However, unlike the demon god domain, these mobile strategic treasures of the Kunlun God domain were all of a combined type. Countless powerful beings gathered together quickly. From their hands they tossed out all sorts of treasures. These single treasures quickly gathered together in the air. Soon they formed a combined strategic treasure. After that, these powerful beings immediately infused their divine powers into it. At the same time, these strategic treasures began to activate their functions. They were either strong defenses or powerful attacks. In an instant, the initiative of the battle returned to the Kunlun God domain's side. Mysterious and powerful strategic treasures appeared one after another. It was only at this moment that the people finally understood what kind of treasures could be called true treasures. It could be said that these strategic treasures could not be controlled by a single person. That was because the amount of divine power required to control them was simply too great. Even the Lord God, Meili, might not be able to control a single large-scale strategic treasure. Of course, other than the large-scale strategic treasures, it was also time for the individual treasures to be put to use. An all-out war had begun. Similarly, it was also the strong against the strong, and the soldiers against the soldiers. After all, most of the powerful beings did not bother to find trouble with those ordinary soldiers. In their hearts, only by fighting with someone of the same cultivation level as them could they ignite their fighting spirit. Most of the time, if these powerful beings did not have an opponent, they would rather not make a move than slaughter those low-level soldiers. As for the ordinary soldiers, they did not have the right to challenge the powerful beings. Of course, if the powerful beings were to court death and run into the midst of the soldiers, then these soldiers would fight with all their might for the sake of survival. Battle cries filled Yi Xian's ears. Soon, blood flowed into a river and then converged into a lake. Every moment, countless people were dying. However, Yi Xian was not in the mood to care about this at this moment. This was because he was fully focused on controlling the chaotic world annihilation array. It could be said that these 49 gigantic swords of the Great Chaos Armageddon formation were the Kunlun God Domain's greatest trump card, their strongest killing move. Of course, the Demon God Domain also had its own trump cards. However, he did not use the Divine Sword to attack. Instead, he used the Dharma Idol Phantom. Because they were too far away, Yi Xian could not see how the Demon God's domain attacked, but he could see the effects. Every once in a while, 10,000 beams of light would shoot out from the back of the Demon God Domain's army. These beams of light rapidly condensed into the form of numerous terrifying demon gods. The moment they appeared, they would slaughter in all directions. One could say that there was no way to destroy these demon gods. They could only wait for them to die on their own. This was because these Fey God Phantoms were immune to all physical damage, all law damage, and all divine power damage. It was almost equivalent to being invincible. However, compared to the Chaotic World Annihilation Gigantic Sword on the Kunlun God Domain's side, the Demon God Domain's ultimate move was obviously weaker. Yi Xian's entire focus was on controlling his Chaotic World Annihilation Gigantic Sword. Below him, 5,000 powerful beings took turns to gather divine power for Yi Xian. Then Yi Xian launched the attack. The battle was endless. Groups of soldiers rushed up, but they were quickly wiped out. In the middle of the two sides there seemed to be a blood-red blockade. No one could do anything to the other. Corpses kept piling up, from 100 meters high to 10,000 meters high. No one could count how many people had died. After all, countless people were dying at every moment. After all, every time they were mobilized there would be hundreds of millions of soldiers. What was a meat grinder? This was the real meat grinder, and it was a god of slaughter. In such an environment, even the strongest mind could be driven mad. This was the main reason why the killing chi pill was needed. Yi Xian watched the battle silently. In fact, he also saw his subordinates being sent out one by one. He watched as the soldiers and experts he had brought with him fell just like that. Unfortunately, this was war. This was the battlefield of the sovereigns. There was no room for choice. No one, from God Master Meili to a common soldier, none of them actually had the right to choose. The battle continued. Yi Xian didn't know who started it, but one thing was for sure. The battle would only end when one side gave in. However, once one side gave in, they would have to pay an extremely high price. So, until the very last moment, no one would give in. Day after day, year after year, Yi Xian controlled his primal chaos annihilation greatsword and killed countless enemies. Meili had issued 3 conscription orders, and in just 9 directions, 60,000 realms, she had sent out nearly 30 billion people to participate in the battle. Finally, the battle was over. When news of the temporary end of the war came, everyone felt numb. Even Yi Xian felt the same. There was no joy, only numbness. However, the war wasn't truly over. It was just another local war. One day, Meili sent someone to find Yi Xian. When Yi Xian arrived at Mida's side, he found out that after several negotiations, Mida had finally gotten the demon god's divine realm's divine lord to agree not to engage in such a fearless war, but to hold a treasure-snatching competition. For this treasure hunt, each side would send 1 divine venerable, 100 divine emperors, 1,000 divine kings, and 10,000 divine sovereigns. These people would enter a secret realm. That secret realm produced a special white stone. In fact, it was completely useless, but it was very rare. Moreover, it was incomparably dangerous. There were countless divine beasts, and there were also some strange things. This time, their goal was to see which side would be able to obtain more of these white stones within 3 days. This would determine the outcome of the war. This secret realm had a total of 86 entrances, with each side occupying 43. It was clear that this wasn't the first time this secret realm had been used for such a thing. Chapter 2404. White Jade Stone. Logically speaking, Yixian was a law enforcer and provincial governor. He shouldn't have been chosen to participate in this treasure hunt. However, it was obvious that Mi Yan had high hopes for Yixian. Yixian didn't refuse and followed the group into the secret territory. The secret territory was huge and the teleportation was random. Therefore, Yixian didn't hesitate and hid himself as soon as he entered the secret territory. Based on his current cultivation of first-grade Divine King Realm, he would not be able to defeat a Divine Emperor Realm expert. The random teleportation made it impossible for anyone who appeared in it to know whether they were friends or foes. Perhaps only the two Hierarch Realm super experts were able to do whatever they wanted. Of course, even if they were besieged, they wouldn't have an easy time. Since they were chosen, how could the Divine Master not prepare any treasures for them? This was a treasure hunt that would determine the outcome of the war. For example, Yixian was given an interspatial ring by Mi Yan before he entered the secret territory. Only now did Yixian open his universe ring to see what was inside. When Yixian checked the spatial ring, he was slightly surprised. This was because there were actually 3 treasures within the spatial ring: a jade pendant, a token, and an ancient map. Yixian knew about the jade pendant. Although it looked like a jade pendant on the surface, it wasn't. It was a special treasure that stored a law attack. Yixian's jade pendant was a defensive treasure that Mi Yan personally prepared for him. In other words, it could save Yixian's life in a critical moment. As for the token, Yixian also knew that it was a special token that was used to seal totem beasts. Similarly, this token must have been prepared for him by Mi Yan. Therefore, the totem beast sealed within it must be something special. One for offense and one for defense, 2 treasures that were personally prepared by Mi Yan. It could be seen how important Yixian was to Mi Yan. As for the ancient map, Yixian didn't know what it was. Helpless, he could only call the system. System. What kind of treasure is this ancient map? Ding. System notification, analyzing data, analysis complete. Ding. The 9 Transformations Godly Annihilation Scroll is a super magic treasure that has been specially forged and then imbued with 9 types of unique laws. Not only is this magic treasure extremely powerful, it also has a unique godly annihilation domain. Yixian was slightly taken aback. He hadn't expected the last ancient map to be the most special one. The only thing that puzzled Yixian was why Mi Yu would prepare such an ancient map for him. It was obvious that this treasure was extremely difficult to obtain. Yet Mi Yu had given it to Yixian. But no matter what Mi Xiao thought, there was one thing that was certain, and that was that Yixian had an additional layer of protection. With these 3 items, it could be said that Yixian's ability to protect himself had increased by a lot. Naturally, his confidence in this treasure hunt had also increased. Yixian carefully released his divine sense to investigate the situation around him. Releasing his divine sense allowed Yixian to sense his surroundings while also allowing others to detect him. Thus, Yixian had to be careful. Of course, releasing his divine sense was also to search for the white jade stones that had a specific target. Not long after, Yixian found a white jade stone. As expected, it was completely useless to Yixian. It could be said that if this jade stone hadn't been given the mission of seizing the treasure, it would have been completely worthless. White jade stones were very widely distributed. Moreover, it seemed that as long as one was in this secret realm, no matter what kind of terrain one was in, it was possible to find this white jade stone. There was no pattern to its growth, but it was very rare. This forced those participating in the treasure hunt to constantly expand their search area. Of course, there were also those who weren't willing to search for the white jade stones. They were more willing to reap without sowing and were more willing to wait and rob others. At this moment, Yixian was carefully searching every corner. These white jade stones were very well hidden. Although they looked like white jade stones on the surface, it was possible to find them even among the trees. Yixian had been on high alert all this time. However, after continuous searching, he didn't find any enemies or divine beasts. Thus, he subconsciously focused more of his attention on searching. Another one. Yixian's figure flashed as he quickly walked towards a small mound. This was because Yixian had found a white jade stone in that mound. However, just as Yixian approached the white jade stone, something strange happened. Boom! Without warning, a fierce attack exploded directly beside Yixian. If Yixian's divine sense hadn't been on high alert all this time, it was very likely that he would have fallen for it this time. Yixian moved his body and dodged the attack. However, when he looked around, he didn't find anything out of the ordinary. Could it be that it wasn't a human or divine beast that attacked me at all? Was this just a coincidence? Yixian looked doubtfully at the pillar of fire that soared into the sky. Just a moment ago, this pillar of fire appeared suddenly and almost caught Yixian in it. Yixian felt the power of the pillar of fire but didn't find it very threatening. Thus, Yixian couldn't help but think that this was just a natural occurrence and not a sneak attack by an enemy. However, just as Yixian was thinking this, the entire ground suddenly began to tremble. Then, pillars of fire appeared one after another. Yixian didn't dare hesitate and immediately dodged in all directions. What was going on? Yixian frowned. As he dodged, he was extremely puzzled. This was because he couldn't find the source of the attack. These pillars of fire were like volcanoes that suddenly erupted. They appeared on a whim without warning and their power seemed very ordinary. However, these pillars of fire had a certain pattern to them. It was as if they were setting up some kind of array. Oh no! It's an array. Suddenly, Yixian came to a realization. Before entering, no one had told Yixian what was inside. Thus Yixian knew nothing about this place. However, Yixian believed that it was impossible for there to be no danger in this mystic realm. After all, this was the mystic realm that determined the outcome of the battle in the divine territory. There was no reason for the sovereigns on both sides to choose a mystic realm that they could enter peacefully and leave after a casual stroll. Therefore, there was only one thing that could be confirmed. This mystic realm that didn't seem special on the surface was actually filled with traps. Countless unknowns and dangers could erupt at any time. Chapter 2405. Fire pillar attack. Yixian's figure quickly flashed. As time passed, more and more fire pillars appeared from the ground in this area, becoming denser and denser. Moreover, the locations where they appeared didn't have any pattern at all. Often, when Yixian dodged a fire pillar, another one would soar into the air in a moment. Of course, these fire pillars were anything but ordinary. The Samadhi Primordial Fire, Ninth Heaven Arcane Fire, Netherworld Earth Fire, Stellar Fire, Sixth Realm Demon Fire, and many other types of flames appeared continuously. Perhaps Yixian would be able to withstand ordinary flames like the Three True Flames, the Six Realms Demonic Flames, and the like. However, when it came to heavenly flames like the Star Universe Fire and the Netherworld Earth Fire, even the slightest touch would be enough to cause Yixian to die without a burial ground. Therefore, Yixian didn't have the time to think about it. He could only continuously dodge. Yixian tried to rush out of this area a few times, but these fire pillars seemed to be controlled by some kind of power. Every time Yixian chose a direction to break out of, the fire pillars would become denser in an instant. Therefore, Yixian's current dodging was also irregular. Using irregularity to deal with irregularity was Yixian's only countermeasure. Of course, in reality, every time he dodged, it could be said to be extremely risky. Yixian's dodges were all done subconsciously. There was no target or pattern to them. However, it was the same for dodging or chasing. Therefore, it was very likely that they would overlap with each other if he was not careful. Boom! Another fire pillar shot up into the sky. However, it was less than a meter away from Yixian. This meant that if Yixian had teleported a little further, he would have died in the sea of fire. Deep Abyss Divine Fire. Yixian's eyes widened in shock. Even the Deep Abyss Divine Fire had appeared. Flames had different strengths. If it was just a flame with elemental energy, Yixian would not be worried at all. However, if it was a flame with the power of laws, Yixian could not help but worry. This Nether Abyss Divine Flame was a special flame that possessed the power of the laws. If they weren't in this place and were in the outside world, then the Nether Abyss Divine Flame would be able to ignite all things, even the laws. Who would have thought that such a flame would exist in this secret realm? Yixian was extremely surprised and nervous at the same time. Looking at the pillars of fire, it was as if they wanted to completely trap Yixian here. Yixian knew that he couldn't just keep dodging like this. One had to know that the space he could live in was getting smaller and smaller. Once the fire pillar appeared, it wouldn't disappear. At this moment, Yixian was already surrounded by countless flames. If this goes on, I'll be compressed by these flames to the point where I won't even have the space to dodge. I can't keep dodging like this. I have to think of a way. Yixian's mind raced. Then, as he dodged in all directions, he began to think quickly. Flying into the air? No, this method wouldn't work at all. Looking at the endless flames that rose into the sky, Yixian knew that there was no way out in the sky. Then what about the four sides? That wouldn't work either. Yixian had already tried. He couldn't go in any direction. Suddenly, Yixian looked at his feet and had an idea. Since the sky and the ground didn't work, why not just penetrate the ground? He wanted to see what was causing trouble underground. With so many flames, Yixian wanted to know what kind of power was controlling these flames. Clearly, the thing that controlled the flames to attack him had a certain level of intelligence. This also meant that these pillars of fire were not coincidental. Thinking of this, Yixian didn't hesitate at all. Megatron Dharma treasure form. Dig underground. Yixian ordered loudly. A moment later, the two god-slaying swords moved quickly and explored the ground. In an instant, sand and pebbles flew and a tunnel appeared rapidly. Of course, Yixian was still very worried. This was because Yixian knew that if a strong pillar of fire appeared now, even Megatron and the god-slaying swords could be melted. However, Yixian had no other choice. If he couldn't think of a solution, he would be trapped here until he died. The speed at which the two god-slaying swords worked together wasn't slow. Yixian didn't hesitate in the slightest and directly followed along the tunnel. This tunnel was very difficult to dig because not only did they have to avoid the pillars of fire that had already appeared, but they also had to be wary of the pillars of fire that could appear at any time. Everything depended on luck because Yixian couldn't predict where the next pillar of fire would appear. Boom! Another pillar of fire appeared. In an instant, it completely enveloped the two god-slaying swords controlled by Megatron. This time it actually hit them right in the middle. Yixian was shocked, but he heaved a sigh of relief after a moment. Fortunately, this time, it was only a mystical heavenly fire. It could be said that this was a blessing in disguise. Although the mystical heavenly fire was powerful, it didn't pose much of a threat to the two god-slaying swords. Down, down, down. The tunnel didn't follow any pattern, but it continued to extend into the ground. Time and time again, they narrowly avoided it. There was even one time when a pillar of fire brushed past Yixian's body, causing his god-slaying armor to turn red and almost melt. However, it was always just a moment because the power of the pillar of fire was not enough. Moreover, as time passed, Yixian could only deliberately hide in the weaker pillars of fire, because at least the pillars of fire that appeared wouldn't take Yixian's life. However, Yixian couldn't possibly know what kind of flames those pillars of fire that didn't appear would be. The feeling of being roasted by all kinds of flames was something that only one could understand after experiencing it for themselves. It wasn't just hot. There were all kinds of flames, and some flames were extremely cold. Some flames didn't have any temperature, but could corrode everything. Some flames could make Yixian's blood boil, and even make Yixian's blood combust. All kinds of flames. Yixian seemed to be going through endless trials. But in the end, Yixian succeeded. Yixian successfully dug a tunnel and pierced through the surface. Yes, it was through the ground. If Yixian hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he wouldn't have believed that this mystic realm was so miraculous. At this moment, Yixian was in a space filled with colorful lights. Above his head was the original sky, but below his feet was an endless void. However, the strange thing was that countless pillars of fire were surging upwards from the void. Chapter 2406. Ancient Law Fire Tree Sapling. This place, for the time being, could be called a forest, or an incomparably strange forest. That was because those trees were growing in two different directions at the same time. It was as if this place was a mirror, and those trees were merely reflections. But Yixian knew very well that it was not a reflection, but a real existence. Because Yixian was here, there was no reflection at all. Each of these strange trees was emitting countless pillars of fire. Those pillars of fire soared into the sky, but after breaking through the sky, they strangely returned to the reflection, forming a cycle. In this way, the energy of these fire pillars was not wasted at all. Yixian looked at the space in front of him in astonishment. Everything in this space had overturned everything he knew. Yixian could not help but wonder, if he had chosen to fly towards the sky from the start, would he have gone to the other side of the reflection like the flames? In addition, Yixian also wanted to know if he could go to the reflection through that virtual existence. The moment this idea popped into his head, Yixian could not hold back any longer. He immediately summoned his withered bone sword servant. In reality, the withered bone sword servants weren't very useful to Yi Xian, but they were perfect for scouting. Go there for me. The place that Yi Xian was referring to was under his feet. It was like the surface of a lake. At the very least, when he looked at it with his eyes, it seemed that as long as he passed through that barrier, he would be able to see the reflection. Of course, the withered bone sword servant didn't hesitate at all, and directly charged towards the face of nothingness. Yi Xian watched the withered bone sword servant with rapt attention. It was getting closer. It was getting closer. Suddenly, the withered bone sword servant seemed to have charged halfway into the lake and directly plunged into the face of nothingness. There was no reaction. Yi Xian did not see his reflection on the other side. Instead, the system notification rang in his ears. Ding! System notification. Please take note, host. The withered bone sword servant has received a destructive attack and is now completely dead. It cannot be revived. What? Complete destruction. And he couldn't be resurrected. Yi Xian was shocked. What happened just now? Yi Xian couldn't help but want to ask, but unfortunately, no one asked. It could be said that Yi Xian had seen everything that had happened, even the slightest bit of change. However, the withered bone sword attendant had disappeared so easily. In fact, Yi Xian didn't even know what had happened when it disappeared. Clearly, it was as if the withered bone sword attendants had entered a lake. They had simply assimilated into the lake. However, at the moment when they completely assimilated into the lake, they were completely destroyed. Yi Xian looked up at the sky, then looked down at his feet. He knew that although it looked like a reflection, it was definitely not a reflection. It was an unknown existence that Yi Xian did not know about. Yi Xian did not dare to recklessly try exploring under his feet. He stood up and walked forward. Yi Xian was a flexible person. Since he didn't have the ability to explore the faceless void, then there was no need for Yi Xian to continue wasting his time there. He might as well continue exploring the forest in front of him. Looking at the various flames, Yi Xian knew that he had struck gold this time. At first, Yi Xian thought that there would be something like a mythical beast. However, all he saw was a treasure trove for him to collect. Yi Xian didn't know what this forest was, but Yi Xian knew what was inside each tree. System, what are these trees? Can you detect them? Ding! System notification collecting data. Ding! System notification, this analysis requires 500,000 conviction points. Host, do you wish to continue? 500,000 conviction points? If it was in the past, there would be quite a few of them. But now, Yi Xian didn't care too much because during this period of time, he had 9 directions and 60,000 realms. Under Yi Xian's deliberate arrangements, Fian had actually been rebuilding her faith. Therefore, many people in the Jufang 60,000 realms had begun to believe in Yi Xian. The Jufang 60,000 realms was so big that even if only a small portion of them believed in Yi Xian, it would be a huge accumulation for Yi Xian. Moreover, he had been in the battlefield of the gods for so many years. Therefore, Yi Xian already had some faith points in stock. Okay, use allowed. Yi Xian agreed to the system notification. Ding! System notification using faith points to analyze. Analysis successful. Target set. Ancient Law Fire Tree Sapling. Primordial Law Fire Tree. A special plant from the Primordial Era. The Primordial Era was an era even more ancient than the Primordial Era. People still had some records of the Primordial Era, but people only had legends about the Primordial Era. Of course, the Ancient Era, which was even older than the Ancient Era, was only a guess. Yi Xian never expected that he would accidentally discover something from the Ancient Era. The Ancient Era had always existed in legends. Even the Ancient Era had no understanding of people, let alone the Ancient Era. However, the system had already said that this was the Ancient Law Fire Tree Sapling. How could Yi Xian not be excited? Looking at the endless forest, Yi Xian was not greedy. In Yi Xian's heart, he would be satisfied if he could get one of these saplings. System, I want to get one of these Ancient Law Fire Tree Saplings. Is there a way? Ding! System notification. Host, please take note. All the trees in front of the host are actually Ancient Law Fire Tree Saplings. What? This time Yi Xian could not hold back. The system said, this boundless forest is actually just a sapling? Of course, although Yixian was surprised, he did not doubt it. After all, it was something from the ancient era. Who would know so much? There were not many records of the ancient era. It could be said that even Meili did not know about the ancient era. In fact, Meili might not even know about the ancient law fire tree sapling. After all, if she knew about it, countless strong people would have entered to search for it. However, it seemed that Meili and the demon god's domain's divine master only knew that this place was extraordinary. They did not know that there was something from the ancient era here. System. How do I get this ancient law fire tree sapling? Ding. System notification. Host's level is not high enough to provide information. System. How much do you know about the ancient era? Ding. System notification. Host's level is not high enough to provide information. Chapter 2407. Unknown influence. Yes, all of this seemed too distant. Even in ancient times, to Yixian it was just a legend. Who would have thought that something from ancient times would appear now? Yixian looked at the forest. He really wanted to take it, but there was nothing he could do. Gritting his teeth, Yixian knew that this time he could only take a gamble. The sapling of the ancient laws of fire tree was an existence that could only be found by chance. If Yixian missed this chance, he might not get a second chance in his life. Therefore, Yixian did not want to let it go, even if he knew that it was extremely dangerous. However, Yixian was willing to take the gamble. Without any hesitation, Yixian extended his hand towards one of the tree trunks and infused it with all his might in an attempt to communicate. Suddenly, it was as if time had stopped. Yixian seemed to have been transported to a mysterious space. In front of Yixian was a small sapling, and there was nothing around Yixian and the sapling, only silence and darkness. Everything had disappeared, be it the laws or anything else. Everything seemed to have completely disappeared at this moment. System, what's going on? There was no response. It was as if even the system had disappeared. This was something that had never happened before. For the first time, Yixian had completely lost contact with the system. Yixian looked around, not knowing what to do. But after a moment, he walked towards the sapling. One step at a time. There was no fluctuation of power, nor was there any law. It was as if he was an ordinary person walking towards a sapling. However, it was a little different from the others. The sapling only had 2 leaves, and it looked so malnourished, as if it could wither and die at any time. Yixian gently stroked the sapling, but his heart was incomparably calm. He subconsciously said to the sapling, "How pitiful. I don't know what you need to continue growing, but you have existed since ancient times, so I can be sure that you have been around for countless years, but you still can't grow. Little sapling, what are you? The ancient laws of fire tree sapling, do you possess the laws of fire?" It could be said that Yixian was a little silly, actually talking to a sapling. However, Yixian did not know why he was doing this. He was just doing it subconsciously. In Yixian's heart, this ancient law fire tree sapling had experienced countless years. It was already an extremely strange thing for it to be able to survive. Not only did he survive, but he also didn't grow in the slightest, so one could tell how lonely he was. It was unknown whether this loneliness affected Yixian, or whether it was for some other reason, but at this moment, Yixian actually began to recall his past, recalling everything that had happened on his path of cultivation. Furthermore, he subconsciously spoke to the little sapling. In the outside world, the 2 people from the divine domain finally began to fight each other because of their exploration. They were constantly fighting over the white jade stones. After all, their main mission was to bring the stones out. However, no matter how much they fought, there was a place that no one dared to go. That was because there were countless flames that soared into the sky. There were also experts who tried to enter to investigate if there were any treasures. Unfortunately, they were swallowed up by the flames before they could even enter. However, if they did not go near the flames would not affect them at all. Therefore, as time passed, people chose to forget about that place. No one paid any attention to that place because they could not enter at all. Furthermore, it seemed that there were no treasures there. The killing continued and countless experts fell. The white jade stones were constantly snatched away by others. Then they were taken away by others. A bloody massacre unfolded in this mystic realm. After all, for the sake of the mission, for the sake of their own divine domain, People had already killed until their eyes turned red. Only within the flames there was peace. Little sapling, do you know? Actually, when I think about it, it has not been easy for me to come this far. Sometimes I even doubt my own future. I don't know how far I can go. Little sapling, I feel that I might be much younger than you. However, I feel that you are more pitiful than me. You are only 2 leaves now. Then, according to the words of us humans, perhaps you are just a baby. Pitiful you, but you don't know how long you have been here. It seems that you are more pitiful than me. Little sapling, do you understand what I'm saying? Sigh, I am really stupid. You are just a little sapling. How could you understand what I am saying? It was as if Yixian had just reacted and laughed self-deprecatingly. He even felt that he was no longer the same person he used to be. This was because at this moment, Yixian had actually given up all his defenses. What divine consciousness? What precept power? What divine power? It was as if these had nothing to do with Yixian. He was just an ordinary person who had lost himself, an ordinary person who did not know his own future. However, the moment Yixian stood up, the entire mystic realm, no, not just the mystic realm, but the entire divine domain was undergoing an unbelievable change. Especially those who had mastered the precept of fire, they could clearly feel it. At this moment in the mystic realm, an upper grade 6 divine king from the Kunlun divine domain, who had mastered the precept of 9 heavens arcane flame, was covered in blood. Beside him, several fire dragons were protecting him. However, it was obvious that he was just an arrow at the end of its flight. Around him, more than 10 experts from the demon god domain were looking at him mockingly. Among them, there was even a lower-grade divine emperor. It seemed that this person from the Kunlun divine domain was definitely going to die. Indeed, there was no way for him to escape. Haha, human, let's see how you are going to escape this time. Leave your life. The divine emperor from the demon god domain said proudly. In his eyes, this person from the Kunlun divine domain had no chance of escaping. However, all of a sudden, the flames controlled by the Kunlun divine domain expert broke free from his control. The 9 fire dragons danced freely in the air, completely unaffected by the Kunlun divine domain expert's control. Humph, how dare you try to resist? Kill him. Unfortunately, the divine emperor from the demon god domain could not finish his sentence because the 9 fire dragons attacked on their own. Chapter 2408. Translator. Nirbo Studio Permanent Supremacy. It was also the law of fire, but it was divided into countless types. However, at this moment, the entire God Realm's law of fire seemed to be overjoyed. The power of the laws? Feelings? Perhaps no one would believe this because this was already something that no one would believe. However, everyone in the divine realm was able to sense this. It wasn't just the divine world. Even the other worlds could feel it. That was because as long as it was the power of fire, it would be incomparably joyful. The flames in the furnace danced, and the heavenly flames cheered. It was as if all flames had lost control at this moment. Brother! A voice entered Yixian's mind, waking him up in an instant. At the same time, the sapling in front of Yixian disappeared. To be more precise, the forest in front of Yixian had completely disappeared. Yixian clearly remembered the word brother, but he didn't hear it again. In the blink of an eye, all of the changes stopped. As for Yixian, he was also dumbfounded by what was happening. He had no idea what was going on. Yixian released his spiritual force continuously in an attempt to find the ancient law fire tree sapling. However, it had already disappeared. Of course, this change didn't last long, so no matter who it was, they didn't notice it in the slightest. They were only puzzled as to why the law of fire had become active, but they didn't know what had happened. Yixian stood on the spot as he puzzledly rubbed his head. What exactly happened just now? Where did the sapling of the ancient law fire tree go? Ding! System notification. The host is in an unknown space and has completely lost contact with the host. Confirmed to be dead. The system will initiate the self-destruct sequence. The system's voice came back, but Yixian did not hear what the system said clearly, so he subconsciously asked, System, what did you just say? Ding! System notification, cancel execution. After that, the system's voice did not continue. Yixian didn't think too much about it. After all, the system often gave him hints, but they were all ignored by Yixian. This time Yixian also subconsciously ignored it. As soon as his voice sounded, Wei Zhentian controlled the two god-slaying swords to fly beside Yixian. Yixian lowered his head to look at the void mirror and said somewhat disappointedly, "It's a pity that my withered bone sword servant disappeared just like that. Sigh, this is a loss. I wonder where the ancient fire tree sapling went," Yixian said as he flew up. However, if Yixian were to take a look at his godhead, he would discover the imprint of a sapling on it. Of course, no one, not even Yixian himself, would be able to see through that imprint. In the outside world, the slaughter was still ongoing. Because the time of departure was approaching, the competition this time was about to end. In other words, the curtains had been drawn on the war between the two divine domains. As for who would emerge victorious, that would depend on this final battle. Everyone was already in a frenzy. Not long after Yixian advanced, he saw a battle. This was a battle between two experts from the Kunlun divine realm and two experts from the demon god realm. Both sides wanted to kill each other and snatch the white jade from each other's hands. Yixian suddenly appeared and heard a Kunlun divine domain elite shout, "Kill them quickly! They have the white jade stone on them." These words were clearly directed at Yixian. Yixian naturally did not hesitate. He still remembered his mission. Wei Zhentian, go! The two god-slaying swords moved quickly. At the same time, Yixian also drew his rule bow. "Die for me!" Boom! One arrow. With just one arrow, Yixian killed an enemy. Ding! System notification. Host has killed a superior grade 3 divine king. A superior grade 3 divine king? What was going on? Yixian was confused. This was because Yixian did not seem to have the ability to kill a superior grade 3 divine king in one hit. One should know that he had only shot out a space rule divine arrow. He had only hoped to restrain the enemy, so that he could use the devouring rule divine arrow to kill the enemy. But why was the enemy killed by Yixian in one hit? Yixian was confused. He pulled open the rule divine palace again, and shot another arrow at the other enemy. Boom! A huge devouring vortex appeared. The enemy did not have the slightest ability to resist and was directly devoured. This enemy was also a superior grade 3 divine king realm expert. Wei Zhentian took the two Qiankuan rings and handed them to Yixian. At this moment, the two Kunlun divine domain elites were looking at Yixian in shock. Yixian's attack power was too domineering. He had killed two enemies with just 2 arrows. More importantly, they could see that Yixian was only a superior grade 1 divine king. Ding! System notification. Host has obtained a special opportunity. From now on, Host will permanently possess the title of supremacy. Permanently? This meant that no matter how Yixian leveled up, he would not remove the title of supremacy. A special opportunity? Yixian was dumbfounded. What kind of special opportunity did he obtain? It seemed that Yixian did not think that he had obtained any inheritance. Of course, this was definitely good news for Yixian. It was just that Yixian did not understand why this was the case. "Are you the law enforcer, Lord Yixian?" At this time, one of the Kunlun divine domain elites came in front of Yixian and asked Yixian. Yixian looked at that person and nodded. "Yes, I am Yixian. Greetings, Lord Law Enforcer." The two quickly bowed. After all, perhaps Yixian's status as the Jiufang 60,000 territories provincial governor was only effective in the Jiufang 60,000 territories. However, this status as a law enforcer allowed him to move freely in the entire Kunlun divine domain. "Rise!" Yixian waved his hand and signaled for the two to stand up. After one of them stood up, he said to Yixian, "Lord Law Enforcer, we shall not waste any more time. There are only 4 hours before we leave the secret realm. We must kill as many enemies as we can and obtain as many white jade stones as possible. Only then can we guarantee our victory." Yixian nodded and let the two leave. However, Yixian fell into a daze again. He realized that he had actually blacked out. He clearly remembered that he had just entered the secret realm and said a few words to the ancient law fire tree sapling. He did not expect that so much time had passed and the battle for the secret realm was about to end. Of course, regardless of the reason, Yixian's most important task now was to find enemies and snatch the white jade stones. Yixian's figure flashed as he quickly charged towards his surroundings. Chapter 2409. Translator. Atlas Studios Editor. Atlas Studios trying to rob? Suddenly, a voice sounded from Yixian's judgment. In the blink of an eye, 3 experts from the monster god realm appeared in front of Yixian. System. Detect the target's strength. Ding. System notification. Target level 5 Superior Divine King Realm, level 7 Superior Divine King Realm, and level 8 Superior Divine King Realm. Yixian frowned slightly. 3 upper-grade Divine King experts. However, Yixian wasn't afraid. Other than the 8th grade King Stage Divine King, Yixian wouldn't even put the other 2 fellows who didn't even have the title of crown in his eyes. After all, Yixian had a revered title, even if he was just a first-grade upper-grade Divine King. However, with a revered title, Yixian would not be afraid of an enemy of the same grade. Even if the other party was an 8th grade King expert, Yixian still had the ability to fight. Yixian slowly pulled out the God Slayer and looked at the 3 in silence. Haha, a mere first-grade upper-grade Divine King expert dares to pull out his sword against us? Haha, do you want to die? Kill him. The 8th grade Divine King expert from the monster god realm waved his hand casually. In his eyes, Yixian was not a threat at all. After all, from what he saw, Yixian's strength was only a so-so. Haha, little child of the human clan, you can't blame us today. If you want to blame someone, you can only blame yourself for coming here. How about it? Hand over your white divine stone now, and perhaps we can consider sparing your life. Yixian's lips curled up slightly. What a nice way to put it. However, they probably did not believe it themselves. Where was this? This was the battlefield of the Overgod realm, and the secret territory that would decide the final outcome. There was no other choice but to fight to the death. Yixian did not hesitate. Against a 3rd grade Divine King who did not even have a title, Yixian did not even bother to use other means. Deity slaying slash. All of a sudden, 7 rays of sword light shot towards the demon god realm cultivator. That person smiled faintly. With this little bit of strength you want to... Unfortunately, his words were meaningless because Yixian's deity vanquishing slash wasn't something he could take head-on. A shield of law rose up from that person's body, but when the 7 sword lights pounced over, it actually didn't obstruct them at all. The shield was broken and he was dead. Damn it, human brat, don't be so arrogant. When the 7th grade Divine King saw his comrade being killed by Yixian, he immediately took action. A phantom of a divine beast condensed in his hand and threw it at Yixian. A strange-looking phantom of a divine beast kept galloping towards Yixian. Yixian raised his eyebrows in disdain. Was that all he had? However, it was far from enough. Boom! The Godslayer struck the phantom directly. In an instant, the phantom was destroyed. Demonic transformation. Suddenly, the demon god realm cultivator reverted to his original form. Generally speaking, whether it was a person from the god realm, demon god realm, or an ordinary divine beast, if they wanted to use the power of law, their power would be greatly increased by transforming into their human form. Therefore, in battle, it could be said that even if they were from the demon god realm, they would rarely revert to their original form. However, this person did not hesitate to revert to his original form. Obviously, his original form had a special function. Little human brat, die. A divine beast covered in black scales spoke in human language. Yixian did not sense a strong power of law from him, but he did sense a mysterious power. An extremely dangerous power. Following this sentence, that person suddenly exhaled a cloud of fog. The fog instantly surrounded Yixian. Oh no, this fog has corrosive properties. Yixian was slightly alarmed. Yixian's corrosive properties did not only corrode Yixian's body. He did not know what kind of power this demon god realm cultivator had cultivated. The fog he exhaled could not only corrode Yixian's body, magic treasures, but also his power of law, divine spark, and soul. Haha, human brat, enjoy this. I'll let you experience the unique soul-devouring fog of our race. The superior grade 7 divine king realm expert said proudly. At this moment, Yixian realized that his divine consciousness could not penetrate the fog at all. This was because Yixian's divine consciousness could not travel far before it was devoured by the fog. At the same time, Yixian's body was also being devoured rapidly. Fortunately, Yixian had the eternal bloodline and could quickly recover himself. What kind of power of law was this? Yixian was slightly alarmed. He had been too careless. He had originally thought that Yixian would be invincible in the same realm as he had the title of supremacy. However, Yixian had forgotten that the power of law was ever-changing. Every person would have their own unique techniques and magic treasures. Yixian had personally experienced the Battle of the Sovereigns, and had personally witnessed the terrifying power of strategic magic treasures. A casual attack could cause the death of hundreds of millions of living beings. Such terrifying power was not something that a single person could fight against. However, Yixian had been careless recently. He had underestimated his enemy and overestimated himself. At the same time, Yixian activated his infinite teleportation in an attempt to escape the fog. Unfortunately, it was of no use. Don't prick me anymore, human brat. You can't escape from my soul-devouring fog domain. The demon god realm cultivator said proudly. Yixian had never imagined that the fog was actually a domain power. Of course, how could Yixian have ever imagined that someone would use their mouth to create a domain? This kind of technique was simply unimaginable. Yixian did not attempt to escape using teleportation, because Yixian knew that if it was a domain power, Yixian would not be able to escape even if he used infinite teleportation. Wei Zhentian! Yixian roared. In an instant, Wei Zhentian controlled the two Godslayer swords and rapidly spun them around Yixian. What Yixian wanted was actually very simple. He just wanted to use Wei Zhentian's rapid rotation to create an isolation zone around him. Wei Zhentian had done just that. The two Godslayer swords' rapid rotation created an isolation zone around Yixian, isolating the fog from Yixian. Yixian quickly thought of a way to get rid of the fog. Perhaps I can dispel this fog with the use of flame law. Unfortunately, I have yet to master flame law. Yixian said faintly. He had just said this subconsciously. Chapter 24:10. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. The five imperial families. Yixian blinked his eyes in astonishment. He could not help but wonder if there was an expert from the Kunlun god domain nearby helping him. Regardless of the reason, since the mist had disappeared, it was time for Yixian to make his move. What's going on? How could my soul-devouring mist be devoured? Human brat, what did you do? The superior grade 7 divine king from the demon god domain looked at Yixian in astonishment. He clearly had the upper hand just now, but the strange flame that appeared out of nowhere had devoured his mist. He could not understand it at all. However, regardless of whether he could figure it out or not, Yixian's attack had already arrived. Boom! A punch! Due to time constraints, Yixian did not draw his divine bow of law. Instead, he threw a punch at the superior grade 7 divine king. The superior grade 7 divine king was still in doubt, so he did not put up any effective resistance. He was sent flying by Yixian's punch. Suddenly a figure appeared. With a casual wave of his hand, he caught the high-rank 7 divine king. It was the 8th grade king grade divine king who had finally made his move. Wei Zhentian quickly returned to Yixian's side. Yixian looked at the superior grade 7 divine king cautiously. Just now, that 7th grade divine king realm expert from the demon god realm had already let Yixian know that he should never underestimate his enemies. Don't think that just because he had the title of venerable, he would be invincible in the same realm. One should know that Yixian did not know what trump cards his enemy had. At this moment, the superior grade 8 divine king from the demon god domain looked at Yixian indifferently and said, "My name is Ci Hao. Human brat, you're not bad. You're just a superior grade divine king, but you possess such combat strength. I have to say that your combat strength is not bad. However, it is also because of this that I must kill you today. Geniuses of the human race should not live in this world." What an arrogant tone. Yixian looked at the expert from the demon god's domain. This person seemed to think too highly of himself. He was only a mere 8th grade divine king, so what if he had the cultivation of an 8th grade divine king? He actually dared to say that the geniuses of the human race shouldn't live in this world. Who did he think he was? However, at this moment, several figures appeared in the surroundings. Surprisingly, there was a human clan expert in the divine emperor realm. Law enforcers, be careful. That's the Beast Monarch clan from the demon god realm. The Beast Monarch clan was a special kind of bloodline. There were many kinds of bloodlines in the demon god domain, but the Beast Monarch clan was the strongest. The Beast Monarch clan wasn't just one clan. There were 5 clans in total. However, almost all of the Beast Monarch clan's divine lords came from these 5 clans. That was why they were called the Imperial Beast Clan. From this, it could be seen that those who possessed the bloodline of the Beast Monarch clan all possessed special means. It could even be said that they were the strongest symbol of the demon god domain. Of course, the Beast Monarch clan was just a derogatory name given by the people of the Kunlun divine domain. However, from the word monarch, it could be seen that even as enemies, the people of the Kunlun divine domain were wary of the 5 clans. System, examine that guy in detail. Ding. System notification, data detection successful. Ding. Target specified, Divine Phoenix Clan of Annihilation. Special bloodline talent. Mastery of the Law of Fire. Once this person attacks, he can control multiple Law of Fire. Moreover, his cultivation speed of the Law of Fire is much faster than others. Divine Phoenix Clan of Annihilation? Yixian had never heard of this clan before. However, no matter what clan he was from, it had nothing to do with Yixian. Yixian only needed to know that he was an enemy. That was enough. Yixian held the Law Divine Bow in his hand, while the Godslayer floated up under Wei Zhentian's control. The battle was about to begin. It was unknown whether it was because Yixian's battle had alarmed the surrounding people, or because it was a coincidence. In any case, more than 50 people had gathered here. However, no matter whether they were from the Demon God domain or the Kunlun divine domain, no one made a move. Instead, they quietly watched Yixian and the Divine Phoenix Clan of Annihilation. This was because these 2 people had high statuses in their respective divine domains. Yixian was the law enforcer of the Kunlun divine domain. At the same time, he was also the provincial governor of the 9 Directions' 60,000 territories. As for the guy from the Demon God domain, he was also one of the 5 Beast Monarch clans in the Demon God domain. Therefore, although the battle between these 2 people had attracted the attention of the crowd, no one came to help. Human brat, remember this. You will die at my hands. At this moment, Ci Hao was pleasantly surprised. This was because he realized that the person he was blocking was actually a high-ranking official of the Kunlun divine domain. If that was the case, wouldn't he be able to obtain more benefits by killing Yixian? Moreover, he was certain that he would definitely be able to kill Yixian. That was why he was so confident. Yixian looked at Ci Hao indifferently and said without backing down, "A mere divine beast dares to be so presumptuous. Then you will also remember this. After all, you will die at my hands today." Yixian naturally sensed the abnormality in the surroundings. At this moment, not only were there many people gathered around the 2 of them, but they also seemed to not be optimistic about Yixian's chances. Even though the people from the Kunlun divine domain did not say it out loud, Yixian could see the worry in their eyes from their expressions. Yixian naturally understood why they were worried. After all, Yixian's opponent this time was not only a powerful being who was 7 grades higher than Yixian, but also a divine beast with a special bloodline. However, Yixian was not worried in the slightest. System, save the special resources that I have collected during this period of time, and devour the rest. Yixian said indifferently. During this period of time, he had accumulated a large amount of resources. Although Yixian was in control of the chaotic Armageddon greatsword on the battlefield of the Lords of Gods, he would occasionally participate in the cleanup of the battlefield. At the same time, Yixian had actually been storing the items from the ancient zither space and the spoils from killing enemies on the battlefield. However, because this was the battlefield of the Lords of Gods, Yixian chose to suppress his leveling up. This was because Yixian knew that on the battlefield of the Lords of Gods, having a higher cultivation base was not necessarily a good thing. This was because the higher one's cultivation base was, the greater the responsibility. At the same time, it also meant that the chances of dying were higher. One should not think that having a higher cultivation base on the battlefield of the Lords of Gods would save one's life. If one thought that way, they would be gravely mistaken. This was because the higher one's cultivation base was, the easier it was for one to be attacked by the enemy's strategic treasures. Yixian had accumulated a large amount of resources but had not leveled up. Now it was time to level up. With Yixian's order, the resources he had accumulated were devoured directly. Chapter 24:11. Translator. Nayerbo Studio Editor. Nayarbo Studio Divine Phoenix Ancestor Dharma Idola Superior Grade 6 Divine King? That was more than enough. Although there was still a gap of 2 grades between him and the enemy, one should not forget that Yi Xian was a supremacy while the enemy was only a king. It could be said that Yi Xian was confident that he could kill this person. Of course, since Yi Xian knew that the enemy was one of the 5 imperial clans of the demon god realm, he would not kill him so easily. After all, doing so could attract the attention of the enemy experts. There were less than 4 hours before they left the secret territory. Yi Xian did not want any accidents to happen in these last 4 hours. The battlefield of the overgods was not a place for one to show off. If one wanted to show off, one would not even know how they died. For example, a person who thought that he was an expert and rushed into the enemy's army. So what if he was strong? Ordinary soldiers could even use their treasures to overwhelm him with numbers. Therefore, even though Yi Xian had clearly increased his cultivation level, he was still only emitting the aura of a superior grade 1 divine king. Human brat die. A strong aura suddenly erupted from Ci Hao's body. That aura was so strong that it seemed to have materialized and surrounded Yi Xian in an instant. On the other hand, Yi Xian's performance seemed to be so powerless that he could only rely on his own pressure to defend himself. However, no matter how much Ci Hao increased his strength, Yi Xian was able to defend himself. Just a little bit more and he could break through Yi Xian's aura defense. Unfortunately, Ci Hao could not do it. Ci Hao's expression changed slightly. After a while he actually laughed. Human brat, it seems that I have underestimated you. You are not bad. You can actually resist my aura suppression. It seems that I will have to stretch my limbs a little before I can kill you. What an arrogant tone. He actually said that killing Yi Xian was just a simple stretch of his limbs. And indeed, when that fella said something like that, even the masses of the Kunlun god domain felt the same way. Even those in the Kunlun god realm did not think highly of Yi Xian. However, no one stepped forward to help, because Yi Xian and Ci Hao's statuses were far superior to theirs. Even if they were slightly stronger, it wasn't appropriate for them to interfere in a one-on-one battle like this. This duel was like a battle between 2 armies, soldier against soldier, general against general, king against king. Yi Xian was now the king of the Kunlun god domain, while Ci Hao was the king of the demon god domain. This was because one of them was a law enforcer of the Kunlun god domain, while the other was one of the 5 imperial clans of the demon god domain. Therefore, it was not appropriate for these ordinary powerhouses to interfere in the battle between the 2 of them, unless Yi Xian or Ci Hao gave the order to attack. Yi Xian smiled but said nothing. The more arrogant this guy was, the more silent Yi Xian became. This was because Yi Xian really wanted to see the expression on his face when he was defeated. Along with Ci Hao's roar, Ci Hao's figure suddenly moved and rushed toward Yi Xian. Ci Hao's original form was the divine phoenix of destruction. Therefore, his control over the power of the law of fire was extremely strong. At the same time he moved, thousands of divine phoenixes appeared in the sky without warning. These divine phoenixes were actually made up of different flame powers. As soon as they appeared, they rushed toward Yi Xian. Yi Xian naturally could not sit still and wait for death. He instantly activated infinite teleportation. However, the divine phoenixes were not slow either. In a moment, they had already caught up with Yi Xian. Boom! A divine phoenix collided directly with Yi Xian. A scorching heat wave suddenly erupted, turning the entire area into lava in an instant. However, Yi Xian was slightly stunned. This divine phoenix's attack did not seem to be very strong at all. Originally, Yi Xian was prepared to be injured because he could not dodge this attack. However, when the divine phoenix collided with him, Yi Xian realized that these divine phoenixes were just for show. In that case, Yi Xian had nothing to be afraid of. With the Godslayer in hand, Yi Xian's figure moved. In an instant, countless figures of Yi Xian appeared in the sky. These were afterimages left behind because Yi Xian's infinite teleportation was too fast. Yi Xian was either slashing, stabbing, or slanting. The Godslayer in his hand rapidly launched attacks. Boom! 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 One by one, the divine phoenixes were all slashed in an instant. This move made the onlookers widen their eyes. Lord Law Envoy, what kind of technique is this? He can actually directly slash through the divine phoenixes that are supported by the law power. This is too amazing. Why can't I see what kind of law power Lord Law Envoy is using? Why does it seem to me that Lord Law Envoy is using his sword to directly kill those divine phoenixes? This does not make sense. Those divine phoenixes are supported by the law power. How can they be killed by ordinary attacks? Damn it, how did that human do it? Although Lord C.I. Hao's myriad phoenix cry is not very powerful, it should not be something that a mere first-grade divine king can break through. Most importantly, that human did not use any law power. How is this possible? I don't believe it. Could it be that my eyes are playing tricks on me? The crowd discussed animatedly. They were filled with disbelief that Yi Xian could kill those divine phoenixes so easily. Even Thornhair was extremely surprised. He originally thought that just this move of the myriad phoenix cry would be enough to injure Yi Xian, but now it actually didn't injure Yi Xian in the slightest. Therefore, he was naturally very puzzled. However, Yi Xian was not surprised at all. This was because Yi Xian did not even feel any law power from those divine phoenixes. In Yi Xian's eyes, these divine phoenixes were just condensed from divine power. Even if they had different attributes, they did not have the support of the law power after all. Was there anything surprising about defeating divine phoenixes that did not have the support of the law power? However, in fact, other than Yi Xian, who could not see that those divine phoenixes had the support of the law power, everyone else could see that those divine phoenixes not only had the support of the law power, but also many of them had very powerful law power of fire. It could be said that C.I. Hao's control of the law of fire was very high. C.I. Hao's movements suddenly stopped. Looking at Yi Xian, C.I. Hao was also puzzled. Could it be that this guy had a special treasure? However, C.I. Hao soon understood. Since this guy was a law envoy of the Kunlun divine realm, it was reasonable that their divine master had given him some special treasures. Therefore, C.I. Hao did not suspect anything. Instead, he continued to attack. Humph, human brat, I don't have time to waste. Now you can die. Divine Phoenix Dharma Idol. C.I. Hao can actually summon the primogenitor Dharma Idol. How is this possible?